Hello everyone, I am Mr. Midnight. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. In the early hours of March 18th, 2024, the coastal town of Brookhaven, Maine, slept beneath a low fog that rolled in from the Atlantic and pressed itself against houses like a held breath. The harbor was quiet, fishing boats rocking gently against their moorings, their ropes creaking softly in the dark. On Seabright Lane, a narrow residential road just a mile from the shoreline, porch lights glowed faintly against the mist, illuminating mailboxes, damp cedar siding, and patches of half-melted snow left behind by a stubborn winter. Nothing about that night suggested catastrophe. Nothing hinted that by sunrise, Brookhaven would become the center of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations the state had seen in decades. At 6:42 a.m., a jogger named Thomas Riley stopped abruptly near the bend in Seabright Lane, his breath catching not from exertion, but from confusion. The front door of the house at number 88 stood wide open, swaying slightly on its hinges. That alone was unusual in a town where doors were locked out of habit, not fear. But it was the silence that unnerved him. No radio, no television, no barking dog, just the open mouth of a house that seemed to be waiting. Riley stood frozen for nearly a minute before stepping closer and calling out. When there was no response, he noticed something else. A smear of dark red along the edge of the doorframe, partially dried, partially absorbed into the wood. Police arrived within 10 minutes. By 7:11 a.m., the Brookhaven Police Department had sealed off Seabright Lane, and officers were moving carefully through the house at number 88, documenting a scene that would unravel assumptions not just about a single crime, but about trust, visibility, and the quiet violence that can hide behind the appearance of a perfect life. The house belonged to the Monroe family. Daniel Monroe was 45 years old, a civil engineer employed by a regional infrastructure firm, known for his meticulous work and quiet demeanor. His wife, Laura Monroe, 42, was a high school guidance counselor described by colleagues as compassionate and endlessly patient. They had 2 children, Ethan, 14, a freshman with a love of marine biology, and Sophie, 9, a bright, talkative child who brought handmade cards to neighbors on holidays. The Monroes had lived in Brookhaven for nearly 12 years. They attended school events, volunteered at community fundraisers, and were the kind of family people pointed to when they talked about small-town stability. Inside the house, police found Daniel Monroe in the kitchen, slumped against the counter, his body positioned as if he had tried to steady himself before collapsing. He had suffered multiple blunt force injuries to the head. Laura Monroe was discovered upstairs in the master bedroom, lying on her back, her hands folded unnaturally at her sides. The children were found in their rooms, Ethan in his bed, Sophie on the floor near her dresser. None of them showed signs of forced restraint. There was no sign of a struggle in any room. The house was tidy. Beds were made. Dishes were clean and stacked neatly in the drying rack. Wallets, phones, and laptops were missing, but nothing else appeared disturbed. By mid-morning, it was clear to investigators that this was not a random act of violence. This was not a burglary gone wrong. There were no broken windows, no forced locks, no overturned furniture. Whoever had entered the Monroe home had done so calmly, confidently, and with enough time to move through the house without resistance. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment suggested the family had been killed several hours apart, likely beginning late the previous evening and continuing into the early morning. The implication was horrifying. This had not been a single eruption of violence. It had been a process. News spread quickly. By noon, national media vans lined the edge of Seabright Lane. Headlines began to circulate using familiar phrases. Quiet town shattered. Family slain in apparent targeted attack. But behind the scenes, investigators were struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew. The Monroes had no known enemies. There were no reports of domestic violence, no financial distress, no recent conflicts that could explain such brutality. Friends and neighbors described them as happy if somewhat private. Private, but not secretive. At least, not that anyone had noticed. As the Maine State Police Major Crimes Unit took over the investigation, attention turned to the family's digital footprint. In 2024, a household left trails everywhere, from smartphones to smart appliances, from location services to cloud backups. Investigators pulled data from the Monroes' home Wi-Fi router, their security cameras, their smart door locks. What they found only deepened the mystery. The Monroes' security system had been disarmed at 9:14 p.m. on March 17th using Daniel Monroe's personal access code. The front door had been unlocked at 9:16 p.m., then relocked from the inside. There were no alerts, no forced overrides, no failed login attempts. At 11:02 p.m., the system logged a manual deactivation of interior motion sensors. At 3:47 a.m., the back door was unlocked and opened. It was never relocked. Daniel's phone last pinged at 9:38 p.m. Laura's at 10:51 p.m. Both devices were then powered down. Ethan's phone had been placed in airplane mode at 8:59 p.m. before the security system was disarmed. Sophie did not have a phone. The timeline suggested something deeply unsettling. Whoever entered the house had known exactly how to disable it. They had known which codes to use, which sensors to silence, which devices to neutralize first. And they had done so without triggering a single automated warning. As investigators began reconstructing the Monroes' final day, they uncovered a detail that would later become central to the case. That Sunday afternoon, the family had attended a community open house hosted by Brookhaven Harbor Services, a local nonprofit involved in coastal conservation and redevelopment. Daniel had recently consulted on a shoreline stabilization project connected to the organization, and Laura had volunteered to help with student outreach programs. The event was well attended, filled with neighbors, colleagues, and visiting contractors. Photos posted online showed the Monroes smiling beside informational displays, completely unaware that within hours, their lives would end. Witnesses remembered one man in particular who had spent a long time speaking with Daniel Monroe that afternoon. He was described as polite, knowledgeable, and professionally dressed, someone who appeared to be affiliated with one of the consulting firms involved in the harbor project. No one could recall his name. No one remembered seeing him leave. By the end of the first week, the investigation had grown beyond Brookhaven. The FBI was brought in, citing the sophistication of the crime and the potential use of interstate resources. Analysts began combing through financial records, employment histories, and encrypted data. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a picture began to form of a family whose lives, while outwardly ordinary, had intersected with something far larger and far darker than anyone in Brookhaven had imagined. Somewhere, the person responsible for the Monroe murders was watching the coverage unfold, absorbing the details released to the public, measuring what investigators knew against what they did not. The fog that had settled over Seabright Lane that morning had long since lifted, but the sense of obscurity remained. Because what had happened inside number 88 was not a crime born of impulse or rage. It was a crime born of access, patience, and the dangerous certainty that no one would see it coming. As the investigation widened beyond the boundaries of Brookhaven, the early certainty that the Monroe murders would quickly yield answers dissolved into a fog of contradictions and uneasy discoveries. The Maine State Police, now working alongside federal investigators, began the slow work of reconstructing the Monroes' lives not as their neighbors remembered them, but as data reflected them. Credit card statements, professional correspondence, deleted emails recovered from servers, and cloud backups pieced together a parallel narrative that existed beneath the surface of family dinners and school meetings. What emerged was not evidence of wrongdoing by the victims, but a growing sense that Daniel Monroe's work had placed him closer to powerful interests than anyone in Brookhaven had understood. Daniel's role as a civil engineer had extended beyond routine infrastructure projects in the final 2 years of his life. Through subpoenaed emails, investigators learned that he had been contracted as a consultant on a federally funded coastal resilience initiative, a multi-billion-dollar program aimed at reinforcing vulnerable shorelines against rising sea levels. The project, overseen by a coalition of private engineering firms and government agencies, had been controversial from its inception. Environmental groups had raised concerns about cost overruns, land seizures, and the quiet displacement of coastal communities. Daniel, by all accounts, was not a whistleblower or an activist. He was a technical expert, responsible for validating structural assessments and signing off on safety certifications. But in January 2024, he had flagged irregularities in a key report involving offshore materials testing, discrepancies that suggested corners had been cut in ways that could lead to catastrophic failure. Those concerns were documented in internal emails sent to his superiors and to a third-party contractor responsible for materials verification. Daniel's language was careful, professional, and understated, but the implications were serious. If the materials failed under stress, entire sections of reinforced coastline could collapse. Millions of dollars were at stake. So were lives. Investigators discovered that Daniel had requested an in-person meeting to discuss the issue, scheduled for March 20th, 2 days after his death. He never made it to that meeting. At first, the theory that Daniel had been killed for his professional knowledge felt too cinematic, too disproportionate to the quiet brutality inflicted on his family. But as analysts traced the Monroe household's digital activity, they found evidence that someone had accessed Daniel's work files remotely weeks before the murders. The access did not come from his office network or his personal devices, but from an IP address routed through multiple international servers. The intrusion had been surgical. Only specific folders were opened, only certain documents were copied, and the access logs had been altered to conceal the timestamps. The implication was staggering. Someone had not only known about Daniel's concerns but had actively monitored his work, and they had done so without his knowledge. Laura Monroe's digital records added another layer to the story. As a guidance counselor, she maintained confidential files on students, protected under strict privacy laws. Yet forensic analysis revealed that her work email had been compromised as well. Messages had been read, not altered, and no student data had been taken. Instead, investigators noticed that the intruder had focused on Laura's personal correspondence, particularly emails discussing family schedules, evening routines, and upcoming plans. It was a level of surveillance that suggested preparation, not curiosity. The children's digital footprints were quieter, but no less disturbing. Ethan's phone logs showed that his device had been placed into airplane mode remotely through a parental control feature Daniel had installed years earlier. The action required administrative access, something only Daniel should have had. Sophie's tablet, though not connected to the internet at the time, had been powered off manually. Whoever entered the Monroe home had neutralized every potential point of communication before violence began. As the timeline solidified, investigators realized the murders had unfolded over several hours. Daniel had likely been killed first, confronted in the kitchen shortly after the security system was disarmed. Laura had been killed later, possibly after being coerced into providing access to additional information or simply to ensure compliance. The children were last. The medical examiner's findings indicated that they had been asleep when they were attacked. There were no signs of awakening, no defensive injuries. The restraint shown by the perpetrator, the methodical progression through the family, spoke to a level of emotional detachment that chilled even veteran detectives. Public reaction intensified as details leaked. National news outlets framed the case as a potential corporate hit, while online speculation spiraled into conspiracy theories involving government cover-ups and shadow contractors. Law enforcement remained publicly cautious, emphasizing that no motive had been officially established. Privately, however, the pressure was immense. This was no longer just a family annihilation. It was a test of whether modern investigative systems could confront crimes executed with both physical and digital precision. Breakthrough came unexpectedly through a financial anomaly. Daniel Monroe's personal checking account showed a small deposit made on February 28, 2024. The amount, just under $500, was unremarkable on its own, but the source was not. It originated from a shell corporation registered in Delaware, with ties to a consultancy firm that had subcontracted on the Coastal Resilience Project. Daniel had never invoiced that firm. He had never acknowledged the payment. To investigators, it looked less like compensation and more like a probe, a test to see whether Daniel would notice, question, or reject an unexplained transaction. He had done none of those things. Instead, records showed that Daniel had forwarded the transaction receipt to his work email, flagging it as possibly misdirected and requesting clarification. There was no response. From there, the trail led outward. Subpoenas uncovered layers of shell companies, offshore accounts, and consulting firms that existed primarily to move money and obscure accountability. At the center of this web was a private engineering conglomerate with federal contracts spanning multiple states. While no direct link to the murders could yet be proven, the circumstantial alignment was impossible to ignore. Daniel Monroe had been a variable in a system that preferred predictability. And variables, as any engineer knows, are liabilities. Despite the mounting evidence, investigators faced a critical obstacle. There was no suspect. No fingerprints had been recovered from the house beyond the family's own. No DNA had been left behind. Surveillance cameras in the area had either been disabled or had conveniently malfunctioned that night. Even the jogger who discovered the open door had passed by only minutes after the perpetrator's departure, yet remembered seeing no vehicles, no movement, no indication that anyone else had been there at all. What haunted the case most was the realization that the murders had likely not been an emotional act, but a calculated decision. The choice to kill the entire family, rather than silence Daniel alone, suggested an intention to erase, not just eliminate. To leave no witness, no leverage, no uncertainty. It was the logic of finality. As March turned to April, Brookhaven struggled under the weight of the unknown. The house on Seabright Lane remained boarded up, a silent monument to questions without answers. Laura's students attended grief counseling sessions. Ethan's classmates left notes at the police barricade. Sophie's empty desk at her elementary school became a focal point for flowers and stuffed animals. The town grieved not only the loss of 4 lives, but the loss of innocence, the understanding that danger did not always arrive from outside, but could slip quietly through systems designed to protect. And somewhere beyond Maine's rocky coast, someone who had planned every step with precision was watching the investigation slow, recalibrate, and stall. They had counted on complexity. They had relied on the assumption that in a world of layered contracts and blurred responsibility, the truth could be buried deep enough to disappear. What they could not predict was the persistence of those left behind, and the way a single overlooked detail would soon begin to unravel everything they believed was hidden forever. The detail that ultimately shifted the Monroe investigation from stagnation to motion came not from a breakthrough in forensic science or a dramatic confession, but from an intern assigned to re-review digital access logs that had already been examined twice. Her task was mundane, almost clerical, a final audit meant to satisfy federal oversight requirements rather than uncover anything new. She noticed that during the remote intrusion into Daniel Monroe's work files, a secondary metadata stamp appeared briefly before being overwritten. It was the kind of artifact that usually meant nothing, a ghost left behind by automated processes, but in this case, it carried a signature format associated with a proprietary network management tool used almost exclusively by private defense and infrastructure contractors. It wasn't proof, but it was direction. That direction led investigators to a company called Norcrest Solutions, a Virginia-based engineering and compliance firm that operated largely out of public view. Norcrest specialized in risk mitigation services for large-scale infrastructure projects, a phrase vague enough to encompass everything from materials testing to crisis containment. They were not listed as a primary contractor on the Coastal Resilience Initiative, but they appeared repeatedly as a subcontractor to subcontractors, a position that allowed them to access sensitive data without being subject to the same level of scrutiny. Daniel Monroe had flagged discrepancies in a report Norcrest had helped certify. As agents dug into Norcrest's corporate structure, they found a company built for deniability. Layers of shell entities obscured ownership. Employees were often contractors with limited paper trails. Internal communications were conducted through encrypted platforms, many of which erased records automatically. But even organizations designed to disappear leave impressions, and investigators began assembling a list of individuals who had access to the systems compromised in the Monroe case. One name surfaced repeatedly: Matthew Calder, 48 years old, former Army Corps of Engineers analyst, Norcrest senior compliance consultant. Calder had been assigned to the Coastal Project in late 2023. He had access to Daniel Monroe's reports. He had attended the Brookhaven Harbor Services open house on March 17th, presenting himself as a visiting consultant interested in community outreach. Photographs from the event showed him standing near Daniel, engaged in what appeared to be an animated but professional conversation. Calder had signed the guest log. He had used his real name. When agents pulled Calder's travel records, the pattern became impossible to ignore. He had flown into Bangor on March 16th and rented a car that same afternoon. The vehicle was returned early on March 18th, less than an hour after the estimated time of the murder's completion. Calder's hotel room had been vacated overnight. Surveillance footage from the rental agency showed him calm, unhurried, dressed neatly, with no visible injuries. He left Maine that morning on a flight to Washington, D.C. Confronted with this information, federal prosecutors moved quickly. A sealed warrant was issued for Calder's arrest, and agents took him into custody at his Arlington apartment on April 9, 2024. The arrest was quiet, almost anticlimactic. Calder did not resist. He did not ask why. When informed of the charges under investigation, he simply nodded and requested a lawyer. What followed was a tense, weeks-long process of interrogation, legal maneuvering, and strategic silence. Calder denied any involvement in the murders. He admitted to accessing Daniel Monroe's files, but framed it as routine professional oversight. He acknowledged attending the open house, but described it as a networking obligation. When asked about the altered security logs, the disabled cameras, and the timing of his presence in Brookhaven, he offered no explanation beyond vague references to coincidence and procedural error. The cracks appeared when investigators confronted him with evidence recovered from an encrypted drive found hidden behind a false panel in his apartment. The drive contained system access scripts tailored specifically to the Monroe household security setup. It contained floor plans of the house, annotated with notes indicating camera blind spots and sensor coverage. It contained a document labeled simply Risk Resolution, outlining a scenario in which exposure variables were neutralized to prevent operational disruption. The language was clinical, devoid of emotion, but its meaning was unmistakable. Still, Calder did not confess. Instead, his defense team pivoted to a strategy that threatened to derail the case entirely. They argued that Calder had acted under directive authority, that his actions, while extreme, were part of a broader effort to protect national infrastructure interests. They suggested that disclosure of the full chain of command would implicate powerful entities and compromise sensitive government operations. It was an audacious claim, and one that placed prosecutors in an uncomfortable position. Behind closed doors, negotiations began. Federal officials weighed the risks of proceeding with a public trial against the potential exposure of classified information. Victims' rights advocates pushed back fiercely, insisting that the Monroes' lives could not be reduced to collateral damage buried under secrecy. The case teetered on the edge of becoming something far larger than a murder trial, a referendum on accountability, in an era where private corporations operated with quasi-governmental authority. As the legal battle intensified, the public learned more about Matthew Calder's past. Former colleagues described him as intelligent, disciplined, and emotionally distant. He was known for his ability to clean up complicated situations, a euphemism that now took on darker connotations. Psychological evaluations conducted after his arrest painted a picture of a man who viewed moral boundaries as situational rather than absolute, someone who believed that outcomes justified methods if the stakes were high enough. The most chilling revelation came from Calder's own words during a recorded interrogation session that would later be partially released to the public. When asked why the children had to die, he paused for a long time before answering. "They were part of the system," he said quietly. "Systems don't function if you leave loose ends." That sentence reverberated far beyond the interrogation room. It captured the essence of the crime in a way no forensic diagram ever could. This was not rage. It was not panic. It was ideology, an adherence to a worldview in which human lives were variables to be controlled, eliminated if necessary, in service of a larger goal. As summer approached, prosecutors made a decision that would define the case's legacy. They rejected any deal that would shield Calder from full accountability, even at the cost of prolonged litigation. The trial was scheduled for January 2025. In the meantime, Calder remained in federal custody, his once invisible life now exposed under the harsh light of scrutiny. In Brookhaven, the waiting was its own kind of punishment. The Monroes' families attended hearings, listened to arguments about jurisdiction and privilege, and tried to reconcile the idea that Daniel's commitment to doing his job correctly had led to his family's destruction. Memorials remained on Seabright Lane, though the flowers wilted and were replaced by weathered photographs and handwritten notes. The town learned to live with a new understanding of vulnerability, one that acknowledged that danger could arrive not with noise and chaos, but with credentials, access, and the quiet assurance of authority. By the time winter returned, the question was no longer whether Matthew Calder would face justice, but what that justice would mean in a system that had, in many ways, enabled him. And as the trial date loomed, it became clear that the Monroe murders were not just about one man's actions, but about the structures that allowed those actions to feel permissible. The trial of Matthew Calder began on a bitterly cold morning in January 2025, though the weight that settled over the federal courthouse in Boston had nothing to do with the weather. By then, the case had already reshaped public conversation around private contractors, government secrecy, and the unseen mechanisms of power that operated just beneath civic life. Security was intense, not because of public unrest, but because of the sensitivity of the evidence and the number of agencies quietly invested in the outcome. The Monroes' extended family filled the first two rows of the gallery, sitting close together, hands folded, faces composed in that particular way grief assumes after months of exhaustion. They had lived with the knowledge of how Daniel, Emily, Lucas, and Sophie died. Now they would have to live through the explanation of why. From the prosecution's opening statement, it was clear this would not be framed as a crime of passion or impulse. The government painted Calder as a man shaped by systems that rewarded silence, efficiency, and obedience above humanity. They described a professional culture where risk meant liability, exposure, and financial consequence, and where removing a problem could, in rare but devastating cases, mean removing people. They walked the jury through Daniel Monroe's discovery of falsified resilience data, the internal warnings he issued, and the stalled responses he received. They described how those warnings threatened to delay a multi-billion-dollar project already under scrutiny, and how Norcrest Solutions had been tasked with mitigating that threat. The defense did not deny the deaths. Instead, they leaned into abstraction. They spoke of national interests, economic stability, and the cascading harm that could result from public panic if the Coastal Initiative collapsed under scandal. They argued that Calder had not acted alone, that he was part of a chain of decisions that stretched upward and outward, and that singling him out was a convenient way to preserve the illusion of accountability without examining the machinery behind it. They did not call him a hero, but they implied necessity, suggesting that in moments of crisis, the line between legality and survival blurred. Witness testimony dismantled that argument piece by piece. Digital forensic experts explained how Calder had personally authored the scripts that disabled the Monroe home security system. A former Norcrest analyst, testifying under immunity, described internal discussions that framed Daniel Monroe as an obstacle unlikely to self-correct. An Army Corps official acknowledged that Daniel's concerns were valid, that the data had been manipulated, and that corrective action had been delayed due to pressure from multiple private stakeholders. Each admission tightened the net around Calder, but also revealed how many hands had touched the edges of the crime without ever stepping fully into view. The most devastating testimony came from a child psychologist called by the prosecution to contextualize the nature of the murders. She spoke not of trauma, but of intent. She explained how the positioning of the children, the absence of defensive wounds, and the timeline suggested deliberate, methodical action rather than chaos. The courtroom was silent as she concluded that the children were killed not because they posed a threat, but because they existed. Loose ends, as Calder had called them. When Calder took the stand in his own defense, the room seemed to contract. He spoke calmly, precisely, never raising his voice. He described his career, his training, the frameworks he had been taught to apply when assessing risk. He did not express remorse in the way people expected. Instead, he expressed regret for the outcome, for the collateral damage, for the burden placed on others. When pressed about Emily Monroe and the children, he faltered only briefly. "I believed," he said, "that allowing the situation to escalate would cause greater harm to far more people." It was not an admission of guilt in his mind. It was a justification. Cross-examination exposed the hollowness of that logic. Prosecutors pointed out that Daniel Monroe had pursued legal channels, that whistleblower protections existed, that no imminent threat required immediate action. Calder had options. He had chosen the one that erased a family. When asked directly whether he believed he had the right to decide who lived and who died, Calder hesitated. "I believed," he said slowly, "that someone had to." The verdict came after 4 days of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. 4 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and federal crimes related to misuse of authority. When the foreperson read the decision, there was no outburst, no visible reaction from Calder. He simply closed his eyes and exhaled, as if releasing a long-held breath. In the gallery, Emily Monroe's sister wept openly, while Daniel's father stared straight ahead, unmoving. Sentencing took place 6 weeks later. The judge spoke at length, not only about Calder's actions, but about the environment that had allowed them to seem permissible. He rejected the defense's arguments about national interest, stating plainly that no system worth preserving could require the slaughter of a family to function. Calder was sentenced to life, without the possibility of parole. In a rare move, the judge ordered a sealed referral to the Department of Justice for further investigation into Norcrest Solutions and associated entities, acknowledging that while one man had been convicted, responsibility did not end with him. In the months that followed, congressional hearings were convened. Oversight committees examined contractor practices, data manipulation, and the blurred boundaries between public service and private profit. Norcrest Solutions dissolved quietly, its assets absorbed by parent companies that denied wrongdoing. No other criminal charges were filed. The system, as it often does, absorbed the shock and reconfigured itself. In Brookhaven, Seabright Lane remained empty. The Monroe house was eventually sold, renovated, its past unmentioned in listings. New families moved in, children played in the yard. Life continued in that relentless, indifferent way time insists upon. But for those who remembered, the silence lingered. Daniel Monroe had believed that doing his job honestly mattered, that truth had weight. Emily had believed in building a home filled with care. Lucas and Sophie had believed in the simple permanence of bedtime stories and morning light. The case became a cautionary tale taught in ethics courses and cited in policy debates, but its core remained brutally simple. When power operates without accountability, when efficiency replaces empathy, and when people become problems to be solved, the consequences are not theoretical. They are human. And once they happen, no verdict, no sentence, no reform can truly restore what was taken. The Monroe murders did not just expose a crime. They exposed a question that continues to echo, unanswered, through boardrooms, agencies, and institutions across the country. How many lives are considered acceptable losses before a system finally admits it is broken? Story 2. On the morning of September 18th, 2024, the neighborhood of Willow Creek Estates in Cedar Ridge, Colorado, woke the way it always did, quietly and without urgency, the kind of place where people measured time by garbage pickup schedules and school drop-offs rather than sirens or headlines. At 6:12 a.m., a dog walker named Hannah Ruiz noticed something unusual as she passed the Reynolds residence at the end of Hawthorne Loop. The porch light was still on, which was odd for a household known for rigid routines, and the front door stood slightly ajar. its edge trembling faintly in the cold mountain air. Hannah hesitated, told herself it was none of her business, then noticed the dark streaks along the concrete walkway, irregular and smeared, leading from the door toward the driveway. By the time she reached for her phone, her hands were shaking. When police arrived 8 minutes later, they would step into one of the most disturbing crime scenes Cedar Ridge had ever known, one that would fracture the town's sense of safety and expose a carefully hidden story of obsession, deception, and violence that had been building for years beneath the surface of an ordinary American life. Inside the house, officers found the body of 42-year-old Michael Reynolds lying face down in the foyer, his right arm bent beneath him at an unnatural angle, his blood pooled into the grooves of the hardwood floor. He had been dead for hours. Upstairs, in the master bedroom, they discovered 39-year-old Lauren Reynolds, still in bed, the covers pulled neatly to her shoulders as if someone had tried to make her look peaceful after the fact. Her cause of death would later be determined as manual strangulation. In the smaller bedroom at the end of the hall, police found 8-year-old Caleb Reynolds and 6-year-old Nora Reynolds together on the floor, positioned side by side, their favorite blankets wrapped around them. Their lives ended not in panic, but in silence. There were no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no indication of a struggle anywhere except the foyer where Michael had died. It was a scene that felt staged, intentional, almost reverent, and it immediately raised the most terrifying question imaginable. Who could have done this, and why would they take the time to make it look like something else? The Reynolds family was well known in Cedar Ridge. Michael worked as a senior project manager for a renewable energy firm based in Denver, commuting 3 days a week and working from home the rest. Lauren was a licensed therapist who specialized in adolescent trauma, running a small but successful private practice out of a converted office near the town center. Their children were active in school and sports, their faces familiar from soccer fields and school fundraisers. Neighbors described them as quiet, friendly, predictable, the kind of family people pointed to when they talked about having made it. That image would begin to unravel almost immediately. Detectives quickly established a timeline. Michael had arrived home at 6:03 p.m. the previous evening, confirmed by neighborhood security cameras. Lauren had canceled her last client appointment at 5:30 p.m., citing a family matter. The children had attended school and returned home on the bus at 3:45 p.m. No one else was recorded entering or leaving the house after Michael's arrival. Phones belonging to all 4 family members had been powered off at 7:18 p.m. Within a 60-second window, that detail alone suggested planning. Someone had been in control of the environment. As news spread through Cedar Ridge, speculation exploded. Whispers filled grocery store aisles and school parking lots. Was it a burglary gone wrong? A disgruntled client? A domestic dispute that escalated beyond comprehension? But the crime scene resisted easy answers. Nothing was stolen. No valuables missing. No signs of chaos. It was as if the violence had been carried out with purpose, not rage. The autopsy reports added further complexity. Michael Reynolds had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck from behind by a heavy object. There were no defensive wounds, no indication he saw the attack coming. Lauren's injuries suggested prolonged pressure, not a sudden act. The children showed no signs of restraint, sedation, or struggle. Toxicology screens came back clean. This was not a crime fueled by drugs or alcohol. It was controlled, measured. Detectives turned inward, examining the family's history. Financial records showed no debt, no gambling, no sudden withdrawals. Lauren's practice had steady clients, many of whom described her as empathetic, grounded, and deeply ethical. Michael's colleagues described him as diligent but reserved, a man who avoided office politics and preferred quiet competence over recognition. Their marriage, at least outwardly, appeared stable. No police reports, no domestic disturbance calls, no visible fractures. But as investigators dug deeper, subtle inconsistencies emerged. Lauren had confided to a colleague months earlier that she felt watched, though she had framed it as professional burnout, the emotional residue of working with traumatized teens. Michael had quietly requested a transfer at work, citing personal concerns, without elaboration. A neighbor recalled seeing an unfamiliar car parked across the street late at night on several occasions, always gone by morning. None of it had seemed urgent at the time. In hindsight, it felt like a warning missed. The first real break came from a device most people forgot they even owned. A smart home hub installed in the Reynolds living room recorded environmental data continuously, including sound spikes triggered by unusual noise levels. While the audio recordings themselves were not stored, metadata logs revealed multiple sharp sound events between 6:47 p.m. and 7:10 p.m. on the night of the murders. Each spike was brief, isolated, and spaced apart, inconsistent with a single violent episode. It suggested movement, activity, a sequence rather than an explosion. Then there was the message. At 11:32 p.m., long after the murders had occurred, Lauren Reynolds' phone sent a single text to her sister, Megan, who lived in Arizona. The message read simply, "I'm sorry I didn't listen." Megan wouldn't see it until morning. By then, her sister was already dead. Investigators could not determine how the message had been sent. The phone's location data showed it was still inside the Reynolds house at the time. The battery level suggested it had been powered back on briefly, then turned off again. Whoever sent it knew the phone's passcode. As the case drew national attention, true crime podcasts began circling, eager to frame the tragedy into something consumable. But law enforcement understood they were dealing with something far more intricate than a single act of violence. This was a story that began long before September 18th, rooted in choices made quietly, relationships built on half-truths, and a presence that had moved closer and closer until escape was no longer possible. What no one yet realized was that the person responsible for the Reynolds murders had not arrived at the house that night in a frenzy or desperation. They had come prepared. They had rehearsed this moment not just in their mind, but in their life, adapting, waiting, watching. And for them, the events of that evening were not a breaking point. They were the conclusion of something that had started years earlier, in a place and time that, at first glance, seemed completely unrelated. The investigation shifted from the Reynolds home to the past, because the present offered nothing but silence. Detectives learned quickly that whatever happened on Hawthorne Loop had not erupted spontaneously. It had arrived fully formed, shaped by time. The first threads emerged from Lauren Reynolds' professional life. As a licensed therapist, she was required to keep meticulous records, and while client confidentiality limited what police could access, appointment logs revealed a pattern that stood out. Beginning in late 2022, Lauren had begun seeing one client twice a week instead of once, a deviation she justified in her notes as acute stress escalation. The client's name, redacted at first, would later become central to the case. What was not redacted was the duration of treatment. By mid-2024, the sessions had continued for nearly 20 months, far longer than Lauren's usual therapeutic timelines. That alone wasn't incriminating, but colleagues described her as increasingly uneasy when discussing the case, referring to the client obliquely, sometimes stopping mid-sentence as if she had said too much. Lauren's colleague, Dr. Angela Morris, recalled a conversation from early summer 2024 when Lauren admitted she had considered terminating the therapeutic relationship but felt cornered. According to Morris, Lauren said the client had become too attached, using language that crossed professional boundaries without ever naming specific incidents. At the time, Morris advised her to consult the ethics board and document everything. Lauren nodded, agreed, then never followed up. Instead, she canceled several social engagements, reduced her hours, and installed additional security features at her home, including motion sensors and the smart hub whose data would later become critical. She told friends it was for peace of mind. In reality, she was afraid. Michael Reynolds noticed the change before anyone else. Text messages recovered from his phone showed concern bordering on alarm. He asked Lauren repeatedly if someone was bothering her, if there was a client she wanted him to know about. Her responses were vague, reassuring, sometimes deflective. She wrote that she didn't want to drag work into home, that things would settle if she handled them carefully. In one message from July 2024, she wrote, "I think ignoring it will make it go away." Michael replied, "That's not how people work." It would be the last message in the thread. Investigators began reconstructing Lauren's final months with increasing clarity. She had changed her routine subtly, leaving her office at different times each day, parking in different spots, avoiding predictable patterns. She stopped jogging alone in the mornings. She asked the school to ensure Caleb and Nora were released only to approved adults, even though there had never been an issue before. These were not the actions of someone spiraling into paranoia. They were deliberate, rational responses to a threat she could feel, but could not yet name publicly. The client at the center of this growing tension was eventually identified as Daniel Hargreave, a 34-year-old software systems analyst who had moved to Cedar Ridge in 2021 following a divorce. On paper, he was unremarkable. No criminal history, steady employment with a defense subcontractor based out of Colorado Springs. He sought therapy initially for depression and social isolation, symptoms Lauren had treated countless times before. Early session notes described him as intelligent, articulate, emotionally restrained. Over time, however, his language shifted. He spoke about Lauren with unusual reverence, describing her as the only person who truly understood him, expressing distress at the thought of their sessions ending. Lauren noted these comments as warning signs, gently redirecting him, reinforcing boundaries. Daniel acknowledged them, apologized, promised to respect the therapeutic framework. Then he began showing up early, lingering after sessions, sending emails that blurred the line between clinical and personal. Lauren responded professionally, briefly, then stopped responding altogether. That silence appeared to be the catalyst. Digital forensic analysis uncovered a disturbing escalation. Daniel had accessed publicly available information about the Reynolds family with increasing frequency. He searched school calendars, sports schedules, neighborhood layouts. He joined local Facebook groups under alternate accounts. He did not contact Lauren directly again, but he watched. When she reduced her practice hours, he noticed. When Michael began working from home more often, he noticed. When the children's routines changed, he noticed. His digital footprint suggested fixation, not impulsivity, and by the time Lauren finally filed a quiet inquiry with the state licensing board about how to terminate therapy safely, Daniel had already shifted from emotional dependency to something far darker. What police did not know initially was that Daniel Hargreave had a history of obsession long before he ever sat on Lauren Reynolds' couch. Records from his previous marriage painted a picture of emotional control and surveillance that had never crossed into criminality, but had frightened his ex-wife enough to leave abruptly and relocate across state lines. She described Daniel as calm on the surface, relentless underneath. a man who believed he was entitled to proximity, to access, to explanation. When she left, he did not chase her physically. He dismantled her life quietly instead, contacting employers, friends, anyone who would listen, framing himself as the abandoned spouse desperate for closure. Eventually, the noise faded. Daniel learned patience. That patience defined what happened next. In August 2024, Daniel took 2 weeks of vacation from work. He told colleagues he was visiting family in Oregon. Cell phone data would later place him in Cedar Ridge the entire time. During those weeks, he refined a plan that had been forming for months. He studied the Reynolds home security system, purchased identical components online, practiced disabling them. He mapped blind spots in the neighborhood cameras. He learned which lights stayed on late, which neighbors traveled frequently, which sounds were normal after dark. This was not stalking driven by impulse. It was preparation driven by belief. In Daniel's mind, Lauren had betrayed him by pulling away, by refusing to acknowledge what he perceived as a profound, mutual connection. The family, in his reasoning, had become obstacles to resolution. The night of September 17th unfolded exactly as Daniel had rehearsed it. He parked several streets away and approached on foot, dressed in neutral clothing, gloves tucked into his pockets. He knew Michael would be the first target. He knew the foyer was narrow, that Michael often set his bag down before turning on the lights. The attack was swift, silent. He disabled the security hub within minutes, just long enough to ensure nothing would trigger an alert. Lauren was next. Their confrontation lasted longer, not because she fought, but because she spoke. Neighbors would later report hearing nothing, but inside the bedroom, Lauren tried to reason with him, to reassert reality, to remind him that what he believed was not real. That was the moment Daniel later described in interrogation as the final rejection. To him, it justified everything that followed. The children were last. Investigators would later struggle with how to present this part of the crime publicly, knowing there was no explanation that could make it comprehensible. Daniel wrapped them in their blankets not as an act of mercy, but as a way to preserve his internal narrative. In his mind, he was not a murderer. He was correcting an imbalance, ending suffering, closing a chapter. Before he left, he powered Lauren's phone back on and sent the message to her sister. He chose Megan because Lauren had spoken of her often, because Daniel believed the message would be understood. "I'm sorry I didn't listen" was not an apology. It was a statement of regret for what he believed Lauren had failed to do. Daniel left Cedar Ridge before midnight. By morning, he was already in Kansas, driving steadily east, convinced he had done something necessary. What he did not anticipate was how thoroughly he had underestimated the system he thought he understood, or how quickly the narrative he built for himself would collapse once subjected to reality. By the time authorities identified him as a suspect, Daniel Hargreave was already watching coverage of the murders from a motel room, his face reflected faintly in the television screen, listening as commentators speculated about motive, about mystery, about evil. He did not recognize himself in their words. He believed the truth, his truth, would eventually be known. And when it was, he was certain it would change everything. It would. Daniel Hargreave was arrested 48 hours after the bodies of the Reynolds family were discovered, not in a dramatic roadside stop or armed standoff, but in the quiet parking lot of a budget motel outside Topeka, Kansas, where he had checked in under his real name and paid cash for 2 nights. When federal agents approached his door just after sunrise on September 20th, 2024, Daniel opened it calmly, already dressed, his hair neatly combed, a cup of motel coffee cooling on the nightstand behind him. He did not ask why they were there. He did not resist. According to the arresting officer's later testimony, Daniel simply nodded and said, "I was wondering when you'd arrive." That composure would become a defining feature of the case. unsettling investigators and the public alike, because it suggested not shock or regret, but expectation. During the initial interrogation, Daniel waived his right to an attorney without hesitation. He spoke in long, measured sentences, correcting detectives when they misstated minor details, offering context where none was asked for. He described his relationship with Lauren Reynolds not as a therapeutic one, but as an evolving emotional partnership constrained by artificial rules. When detectives challenged that characterization, Daniel smiled faintly and said, "That's the version you're allowed to see." He admitted to being present at the Reynolds home on the night of the murders, but resisted the word killed, preferring phrases like resolved and ended. Each semantic dodge deepened the sense that Daniel was operating within a moral framework entirely his own. What shocked investigators most was not his admission, but his insistence that Lauren had understood him in the end. Daniel claimed that during their final interaction, Lauren had acknowledged the connection between them, that her last words were not pleas or protests, but a quiet recognition that things had gone too far. There was no evidence to support this claim. Autopsy results showed Lauren had sustained injuries consistent with prolonged struggle, and forensic analysis of the bedroom suggested she had attempted to reach her phone during the attack. Still, Daniel clung to his version of events with unwavering certainty. In his mind, truth was not defined by facts, but by belief. As the case moved toward prosecution, Cedar Ridge became a town suspended between grief and paranoia. Parents walked their children to school even in daylight. Porch lights stayed on through the night. People replayed memories of Daniel Hargreave in their minds, searching for signs they might have missed, moments when danger had brushed past unnoticed. Some recalled seeing him at community events, standing alone at the edges of crowds, polite but distant. Others realized they had mistaken his quietness for harmlessness, his restraint for decency. The idea that someone could exist among them for years, watching, calculating, planning without raising alarm, was harder to process than the violence itself. The prosecution's case rested not on emotion, but on accumulation. They built a timeline so precise it left little room for doubt. Cell tower pings placed Daniel near the Reynolds home at the exact times corresponding to the smart hub sound spikes. Surveillance footage from a gas station 20 miles away captured his car shortly after midnight, the license plate clearly visible. His laptop contained drafts of unsent emails to Lauren, growing more accusatory over time, as well as documents mapping her daily schedule. Most damning of all was a private journal file recovered from an encrypted drive, titled simply Clarifications, in which Daniel outlined his reasoning in chilling detail. He wrote about entitlement as a misunderstood concept, about how emotional labor created obligation, about how rejection, when unjustified, constituted harm. The final entry, dated September 16th, ended with the sentence, "Tomorrow this ends." Defense attorneys attempted to frame Daniel as mentally ill, a man suffering from delusional attachment exacerbated by professional negligence. They argued that Lauren had failed to properly disengage, that her kindness had been misinterpreted, that Daniel's actions were the result of untreated obsession rather than malice. But expert witnesses dismantled that narrative carefully. Psychiatrists testified that while Daniel exhibited narcissistic and obsessive traits, he was fully capable of distinguishing right from wrong. He had planned extensively, concealed his actions, fled the state, and attempted to control the narrative afterward. These were not the actions of someone detached from reality. They were the actions of someone who believed reality should conform to him. As pretrial hearings dragged on, the public learned more about the final days of the Reynolds family, details that made the loss feel heavier with each revelation. Lauren had drafted an email to the state board requesting immediate guidance on terminating a client relationship safely. It was saved in her drafts folder, never sent. Michael had researched restraining orders the week before the murders, his browser history revealing searches for how to protect family from stalker and client harassment therapist. He had planned to act. He had run out of time. The children's teachers testified about Caleb's excitement for an upcoming science fair and Nora's insistence on practicing her reading aloud every afternoon. These details, seemingly small, took on unbearable weight in the courtroom, reminders that the lives Daniel dismissed as secondary had been vibrant, unfolding, unfinished. Each testimony chipped away at the defense's attempts to abstract the crime into psychological jargon. This was not a theoretical failure. It was a massacre carried out in a home filled with ordinary love. Daniel watched these proceedings with visible detachment. He took notes occasionally, whispered to his attorneys, adjusted his tie. When shown photographs of the crime scene, he did not look away. Instead, he frowned slightly as if something about the presentation displeased him. At one point during a recess, he asked a deputy whether Lauren's sister was present in the courtroom. When told she was, he nodded and said, "Good. She should hear this." That comment would later circulate widely, igniting public outrage and solidifying Daniel's image not just as a killer, but as something colder, more deliberate, less human. By the time closing arguments approached, the case had become more than a prosecution of one man. It was a reckoning with the limits of professional boundaries, with the danger of obsession disguised as vulnerability, with the way modern life allows fixation to grow unseen behind screens and polite smiles. The jury, sequestered and exhausted, carried not only the responsibility of judgment, but the emotional weight of a story that resisted easy conclusions. Outside the courthouse, memorials for the Reynolds family multiplied. Flowers, handwritten notes, children's drawings lined the steps. A phrase began appearing again and again on posters and vigils, simple and haunting in its clarity. Kindness is not consent. It became a rallying cry, a warning, a plea. For many, the case was no longer just about what Daniel Hargreave had done, but about how easily empathy could be weaponized, how thin the line was between care and control when one person decided their feelings mattered more than another's autonomy. As the trial moved into its final phase, one question lingered above all others, unspoken but heavy in the air. Not whether Daniel Hargreave was guilty, but whether the systems designed to protect people like Lauren Reynolds had failed so completely that the outcome had become inevitable. The verdict would decide Daniel's fate. It would not bring the Reynolds family back, and it would not fully answer how a quiet town, a trusted profession, and a series of missed moments had converged into one irreversible night. The jury returned after 11 hours of deliberation spread across 2 days, their faces drawn, eyes avoiding the gallery as they filed back into the courtroom. Cedar Ridge had been holding its breath since closing arguments ended, the town caught in that uneasy space between knowing and hearing, between certainty and confirmation. When the foreperson stood, hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the verdict form, the silence felt almost physical. Guilty on all counts. 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of aggravated burglary, 1 count of stalking resulting in death, 1 count of attempted obstruction. There was no audible reaction from Daniel Hargreave. He did not flinch, did not bow his head, did not look toward the Reynolds family. He simply stared forward, lips pressed together, as if listening to a diagnosis rather than a judgment. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, and in that time the case continued to reverberate far beyond the walls of the courtroom. National media descended on Cedar Ridge, reframing the story again and again. A therapist killed by a former client, a family annihilated by obsession, a system that failed to intervene in time. Commentators argued over warning signs, over ethical gray areas, over whether Lauren Reynolds could have done anything differently. Her colleagues pushed back fiercely against that framing, issuing open letters and professional statements reminding the public that responsibility for violence always lies with the perpetrator, not the person who tried to help. Still, the question lingered uncomfortable and unresolved because it touched something deeper than policy. It touched fear. During the sentencing hearing, the courtroom filled with voices that had been absent during the trial itself. Friends, colleagues, neighbors. Lauren's sister spoke first, her voice steady despite the strain behind it. She talked about Lauren not as a victim, but as a presence, a woman who laughed too loudly at bad jokes, who believed fiercely in the possibility of change, who never stopped learning how to care better. Michael's brother followed, describing a man who fixed broken appliances for neighbors without being asked, who coached Little League even when he worked late, who believed that showing up mattered more than being impressive. Then came the teachers, the parents of classmates, the people who had watched Caleb and Nora grow. They spoke of unfinished science projects, of library books still checked out, of shoes left by the door. When it was Daniel Hargreaves' turn to speak, his attorneys advised him against it. He ignored them. He stood, smoothed the front of his jacket, and addressed the court in the same measured tone he had used from the beginning. He did not apologize. Instead, he spoke of misunderstanding, of narratives imposed upon him, of a society unwilling to confront the harm of emotional abandonment. He said Lauren had represented hope and then withdrawn it. He said the system had failed both of them. At one point, he turned slightly, as if addressing the Reynolds family directly, and said, "I regret that this became so extreme." The judge cut him off before he could continue. The sentence, when it came, was absolute. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, 4 times over, to be served consecutively. The judge's words were careful, deliberate, stripped of flourish. He spoke of premeditation, of cruelty, of the irrevocable harm done not just to one family but to a community's sense of safety. He spoke of choice. When he finished, Daniel was led away without looking back. In the months that followed, Cedar Ridge began the slow, uneven process of living again. The Reynolds house was eventually demolished, the lot left empty by the family's request. In its place, the town planted trees, a small grove with a stone marker bearing 4 names. No dates, no description, just names. The local school district established a scholarship in Lauren's honor for students pursuing mental health professions, paired with mandatory coursework on boundaries, risk assessment, and practitioner safety. Therapists across the state attended new trainings, revised protocols, created emergency consultation lines. Change came, not because it could undo what happened, but because doing nothing felt like complicity. Daniel Hargreaves faded from public view, transferred between facilities, his appeals denied in quick succession. Occasionally, his name resurfaced in academic discussions, in case studies, in conferences about stalking and fixation. He became an example, a cautionary tale, a data point. But in Cedar Ridge, people rarely spoke his name anymore. They spoke Lauren's, they spoke Michael's, they spoke Caleb's and Nora's. They spoke about kindness and caution, about listening to instincts, about the difference between empathy and obligation. The case left behind no neat lessons, no comforting resolutions. It left behind questions that resisted closure. How do you help without endangering yourself? How do you recognize when vulnerability becomes entitlement? How many warning signs must appear before action feels justified? These questions lingered in classrooms, in therapy offices, in living rooms long after the headlines moved on. What remained most vividly was not the violence itself, but the ordinariness that preceded it. A grocery run, a school pickup, a draft email never sent. The story of the Reynolds family became a reminder not only of how tragedy can strike, but of how quietly it can approach, how easily it can hide behind civility and patience, and the assumption that people mean no harm. In the end, this was not just a story about a crime committed in 2024 in the United States. It was a story about trust and its betrayal, about systems stretched thin, about the cost of ignoring unease because naming it feels impolite. It was about a family who lived fully until they were taken, and a community that learned too late that safety is not guaranteed by good intentions alone. The Reynolds family did not become symbols by choice. They became them because the world needed a way to understand what had been lost. And in remembering them, in telling their story carefully and honestly, perhaps something fragile but necessary survives. The resolve to protect without blame, to care without surrender, and to recognize that boundaries are not barriers to compassion, but the very thing that makes compassion possible. Story 3. On a humid evening in late September 2012, the city of Gurgaon, India, shimmered with the confidence of a nation racing toward modernity. Glass office towers reflected neon lights, luxury apartments promised safety behind gated walls, and the expanding middle class believed that prosperity had finally brought protection. Gurgaon was marketed as the future, secure, global, aspirational. But behind the polished surfaces, a darker reality simmered. That night, inside a high-rise residential complex meant to symbolize comfort and security, a young family would be destroyed in a crime so brutal, so preventable, and so revealing of systemic failure that it would shake India's criminal justice system to its core. What unfolded was not a random act of violence. It was the predictable result of negligence, inequality, ignored warnings, and a justice system that consistently failed to see danger until it was too late. The Batra family embodied everything India's new urban dream promised. Rajesh Batra, 48 years old, was a senior executive at a multinational pharmaceutical company. Soft-spoken, meticulous, and deeply committed to his work, Rajesh had spent more than 2 decades climbing the corporate ladder through diligence rather than connections. Born into a modest household in Kanpur, he had earned his MBA through scholarships and night classes, believing that education was the only true escape from poverty. His wife, Nandini Batra, 45, was a former schoolteacher who had left her job to raise their only child, but remained deeply involved in volunteer education programs for underprivileged girls. She was known in the residential complex for her warmth, her quiet strength, and her unwavering belief that kindness could reshape society. Their daughter, 14-year-old Ananya Batra, was the center of their universe. Bright, articulate, and fiercely curious, Ananya attended a prestigious private school where she excelled academically and showed a particular talent for science and creative writing. Teachers described her as unusually empathetic for her age, the kind of student who noticed when classmates were struggling and tried to help without drawing attention to herself. She dreamed of becoming a doctor, inspired by her father's work in healthcare and her mother's commitment to social service. On weekends, she volunteered with her mother at a neighborhood learning center, tutoring children who came from families far poorer than her own. The Batras believed deeply in the idea that success carried responsibility. They lived on the 12th floor of Lotus Heights, a gated residential complex in Gurgaon Sector 56. The building advertised 24-hour security, CCTV coverage, access-controlled elevators, and trained guards at every entry point. Residents paid high maintenance fees for the promise of safety. Guards were stationed at the gates, visitors were logged, and residents believed the layers of protection insulated them from the dangers that plagued other parts of the city. Like many families in similar complexes, the Batras trusted the system implicitly. They had no reason not to, but that trust would become their greatest vulnerability. Unbeknownst to the Batras, they had been observed for months by people who moved through their lives almost invisibly. Lotus Heights employed dozens of contract workers, security guards, cleaning staff, electricians, delivery personnel, most hired through third-party agencies that conducted minimal background checks. Among them was 32-year-old Rakesh Kumar, a maintenance worker assigned to the complex's electrical systems. Rakesh had arrived in Gurgaon 2 years earlier from a small village in Bihar, carrying a history of violence that followed him quietly across state lines. He had been arrested twice for assault and once for attempted sexual violence, but due to procedural delays, witness intimidation, and out-of-court settlements, he had never served more than a few months in custody. His records were scattered across jurisdictions, never consolidated, never flagged. Rakesh worked alongside another man, 28-year-old Sunil Yadav, a contract cleaner responsible for late-night sanitation duties in common areas. Sunil's past was similarly troubling. He had grown up in an abusive household and had dropped out of school early, drifting between jobs and petty crimes. He had been detained multiple times for theft and harassment, but had never been convicted. Like Rakesh, he existed in the gaps of India's criminal justice system, known to police, but never contained. The two men bonded over long night shifts, shared grievances about wealth inequality, and a growing resentment toward the residents they served. Over time, resentment hardened into something darker. Security footage would later reveal that Rakesh and Sunil spent weeks observing residents' routines. They learned which apartments were occupied late, which families traveled often, which guards were inattentive, and which security cameras had blind spots. The Batras, with their predictable schedules and polite interactions, stood out. Rajesh often returned late from work. Nandini and Ananya were frequently alone in the evenings. The men noticed Ananya's kindness, her habit of greeting staff, her willingness to stop and chat. What the family saw as basic decency, the men interpreted as accessibility. The seeds of the crime were planted not in a single moment, but through prolonged exposure, festering resentment, and institutional indifference. On Saturday, September 22, 2012, the Batras followed their usual routine. Rajesh left early for a business conference in Mumbai, planning to return the next evening. Nandini and Ananya spent the day at home, catching up on schoolwork and household chores. That evening, Nandini spoke to her husband on the phone, laughing as she described Ananya's plans to bake cupcakes for a school fundraiser the next day. Nothing about the day suggested danger. Inside Lotus Heights, life continued as normal. Guards changed shifts. Cleaning crews worked quietly through hallways. CCTV cameras recorded footage no one was actively watching. At approximately 10:30 p.m., Rakesh and Sunil finished their assigned duties. Instead of clocking out, they remained inside the complex. Later investigations would reveal that the night guard at the service entrance, exhausted and underpaid, had fallen asleep during his shift. Another guard had left his post briefly to purchase tea. No alarms were triggered. No logs were updated. The layers of security the residents relied on existed mostly on paper. Shortly before midnight, the two men entered the service elevator using a keycard Rakesh had obtained weeks earlier by exploiting lax access controls. The elevator did not require destination authorization. They rode silently to the 12th floor, carrying with them tools that blended seamlessly into the environment: rope, duct tape, a screwdriver, and a small knife taken from the maintenance room. Nothing about their appearance would have raised suspicion. They looked like workers finishing a late shift. At 12:17 a.m., CCTV cameras captured them stepping off the elevator into the Batra's corridor. The footage showed them pausing briefly, listening. The hallway was quiet. Inside the apartment, Nandini was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner while Ananya worked on her laptop in her bedroom. They had locked the main door, believing the complex's security rendered additional vigilance unnecessary. Rakesh knocked. When Nandini opened the door slightly, Rakesh claimed there was an electrical fault reported in the unit below and requested a quick inspection. This was not unusual. Maintenance visits at odd hours were common in Lotus Heights due to frequent power fluctuations. Trusting the familiar uniform and reassured by years of uneventful interactions, Nandini unlatched the door. That moment, brief, mundane, and entirely reasonable, would seal their fate. The men forced their way inside with shocking speed. Nandini was pushed to the floor before she could scream. Sunil slammed the door shut while Rakesh restrained her, pressing a cloth over her mouth. Ananya heard the commotion and ran toward the living room, only to be grabbed from behind and dragged into her parents' bedroom. The men tied both mother and daughter with rope and duct tape, working with rehearsed efficiency. They told them it was a robbery, that they only wanted money and jewelry, that if they cooperated, no one would be hurt. It was a lie that would be repeated again and again as a form of control. For the next several hours, the Batras endured unimaginable terror. The men ransacked the apartment, demanding passwords, bank details, and valuables. They threatened Ananya to coerce Nandini into compliance. At one point, Nandini pleaded with them to take everything and leave, offering cash, jewelry, even her wedding ring. Her words fell on deaf ears. The men were no longer motivated by theft. The situation had crossed into something far more dangerous. Throughout the ordeal, the security systems that were meant to protect the family remained silent. CCTV cameras recorded but did not alert. Guards remained unaware. Neighbors, insulated by thick walls and the illusion of safety, heard nothing unusual. The crime unfolded in isolation, hidden in plain sight within a building full of people. As the night dragged on, the violence escalated. The men assaulted Nandini and Ananya in ways too horrific to fully recount. Evidence later confirmed prolonged abuse, intentional cruelty, and deliberate infliction of fear. The psychological torment was as calculated as the physical violence. They wanted control. They wanted dominance. They wanted to erase resistance completely. By dawn, the men realized that Rajesh would soon return from Mumbai. They knew the window for escape was closing. Panic replaced confidence. What began as an opportunistic invasion had become a situation they believed could only end one way. They discussed options in hushed tones, pacing through the apartment, glancing repeatedly at the door and the windows. The possibility of witnesses, of police involvement, of consequences loomed larger with every passing minute. At approximately 6:45 a.m., Rakesh made a decision. Later, prosecutors would describe it as the moment when the crime became irreversible. The men strangled Nandini using the rope they had brought with them. Ananya, still bound, was forced to watch. Minutes later, she too was killed. The silence that followed was absolute. 2 lives were extinguished not in a fit of rage, but through deliberate, methodical violence. After the murders, the men attempted to stage the scene as a burglary gone wrong. They wiped surfaces, gathered stolen items, and changed clothes using garments from the apartment. They exited the building through the same service elevator they had used to enter, passing security cameras that captured their departure without triggering any alarms. By the time Rajesh landed in Delhi that morning and began his drive home, the system that was supposed to protect his family had already failed at every level. Rajesh arrived at Lotus Heights shortly after 9:30 a.m. He noticed nothing unusual as he parked his car and entered the building. Guards nodded politely. Elevators functioned normally. The building appeared peaceful. When he reached his apartment and received no response to repeated knocks, unease set in. Using his key, he entered the apartment and was met with a silence that felt wrong. The disarray in the living room confused him at first. Then he found Nandini, then Ananya. The screams that followed shattered the illusion of safety that Lotus Heights had sold its residents. By the time police arrived, the truth was already evident. 2 lives had been brutally taken inside a building that promised security. As investigators began reconstructing the timeline, the patterns of failure emerged with devastating clarity. The men responsible were not strangers. They were not outsiders. They were employees. They were known. They had histories. They had access. And no one had stopped them. This was not just a crime. It was a warning that went unheeded until it was too late. The investigation that followed unfolded with an urgency matched only by the horror of what had been discovered. Gurgaon police cordoned off the 12th floor of Lotus Heights within hours, sealing the Batra's apartment as forensic teams began their work. News spread quickly through the complex, transforming a place of comfort into a scene of fear and disbelief. Residents gathered in hushed clusters, whispering questions no one could answer. How could this happen here? Who could do this? The answers, when they came, would be more disturbing than anyone imagined. Inside the apartment, investigators documented evidence that painted a grim picture of prolonged captivity and deliberate violence. The bindings used on Nandini and Ananya were traced back to materials from the building's maintenance storage. Tool marks matched equipment issued to contract workers. There were no signs of forced entry at the main door, a detail that immediately shifted suspicion inward. This was not a break-in from the outside. Someone with legitimate access had walked through the front door. That realization sent a chill through every resident and official involved. CCTV footage became the backbone of the investigation. Although the system had failed to prevent the crime, it had quietly recorded it. Officers retrieved hours of footage from the service elevators, corridors, and entry points. Analysts identified 2 men entering the Batra's floor late at night and exiting early the next morning carrying bags. Their faces were partially visible. Their uniforms were unmistakable. Within 24 hours, the men were identified as Rakesh Kumar and Sunil Yadav, both contract workers assigned to Lotus Heights. The revelation was devastating. The threat had come from within the very system meant to protect residents. Police moved quickly. Raids were conducted at the men's rented rooms in nearby settlements. Stolen jewelry was recovered, along with clothing that matched what was seen on CCTV footage. More damning still were items that directly connected them to the crime scene: rope fibers, duct tape, and personal belongings of the victims. Both men were arrested within 48 hours of the murders. As word of their capture spread, anger erupted across Gurgaon and beyond. Candlelight vigils turned into protests. Social media exploded with outrage directed not only at the perpetrators, but at the security agencies, the housing complex management, and the government itself. Interrogations revealed a chilling level of premeditation. Rakesh and Sunil admitted to watching the Batras for weeks. They described learning their routines, exploiting security lapses, and planning their entry. Their statements confirmed what investigators already suspected. This was not an impulsive crime. It was calculated, rehearsed, and facilitated by systemic negligence. The men spoke of resentment, of feeling invisible, of believing the wealthy residents lived without consequence. Their words exposed a psychological divide that extended far beyond Lotus Heights. As details emerged, the public began asking difficult questions. How had 2 men with known criminal histories been employed in a high-security residential complex? Why were background checks superficial or non-existent? Why did security guards have unchecked access to keycards and elevators? The answers pointed to a fragmented system where responsibility was outsourced, accountability diluted, and safety treated as a marketing feature rather than a real obligation. Rajesh Batra, meanwhile, existed in a state of shock that defied description. He was hospitalized briefly after collapsing at the scene, sedated to prevent further physical harm. When he emerged, he faced a reality stripped of everything that had given his life meaning. His wife and daughter were gone. His home was a crime scene. His sense of safety permanently shattered. In the days following the murders, he refused to speak publicly, retreating instead into a silence broken only by grief. But silence would not last. As the legal process began, Rajesh was forced into the role of witness and symbol. He attended identification parades, reviewed evidence, and listened as prosecutors detailed the final hours of his family's lives. Each revelation reopened wounds. Each court appearance demanded composure in the face of unimaginable pain. The weight of survival pressed heavily on him. He had lived, they had not, and now he was expected to carry their story. The trial of Rakesh Kumar and Sunil Yadav began in early 2013 and quickly became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in India. Media coverage was relentless. Courtrooms overflowed with journalists, activists, and members of the public. Prosecutors presented a case built on forensic evidence, CCTV footage, confessions, and expert testimony. They argued that the murders were the culmination of unchecked access, ignored warning signs, and institutional failure. The defense attempted to paint the accused as products of poverty and abuse, citing their upbringing and lack of opportunity as mitigating factors. The court, however, remained focused on the brutality of the crime. Testimony from forensic experts revealed the extent of the violence inflicted on Nandini and Ananya. Medical reports confirmed prolonged suffering, intentional restraint, and deliberate killing. CCTV footage was played repeatedly, showing the men's calm entry and exit from the building. Security officials from Lotus Heights were called to the stand, where they admitted under oath that background checks were minimal, access controls were lax, and guards were often overworked and undertrained. Each admission reinforced the narrative of a system that had failed long before the crime occurred. Public reaction grew increasingly intense. Women's rights groups organized demonstrations, demanding stricter laws and better enforcement. Housing associations across major Indian cities faced scrutiny as residents questioned their own safety. Government officials promised reforms, inspections, and new guidelines, but many saw these promises as familiar, reactive gestures rather than meaningful change. In late 2013, the court delivered its verdict. Both Rakesh Kumar and Sunil Yadav were found guilty on multiple counts, including murder, sexual assault, kidnapping, and criminal conspiracy. The sentencing phase that followed reignited national debate. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing that the crime met the rarest of the rare standard under Indian law. They emphasized the calculated nature of the murders, the abuse of trust, and the extreme cruelty inflicted on a mother and child. The defense pleaded for life imprisonment, citing the accused's backgrounds and the potential for rehabilitation. Rajesh Batra addressed the court during sentencing. His statement was quiet, controlled, and devastating. He spoke of his wife's kindness, his daughter's dreams, and the future that had been stolen. He did not ask for revenge. He asked for accountability. He asked for a system that would prevent other families from suffering the same fate. His words resonated far beyond the courtroom, turning personal grief into a broader call for justice. In January 2014, the court sentenced both men to death. The judgment cited the brutality of the crime, the breach of trust, and the need for deterrence. For many, the verdict felt like closure. For others, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in an ongoing debate about capital punishment, systemic reform, and the limits of justice. But the story did not end there. As appeals wound their way through higher courts, the case continued to expose deep flaws in India's urban security infrastructure. Investigations into Lotus Heights revealed widespread noncompliance with safety regulations. Security agencies faced fines and contract terminations. Government audits uncovered similar vulnerabilities in residential complexes across the country. The murders became a case study in how modernity without accountability could create the illusion of safety while masking profound risk. Rajesh Batra began to speak publicly, not out of choice, but out of necessity. He testified before committees, met with policymakers, and spoke at conferences on urban safety and victim rights. His advocacy was measured but relentless. He argued that security could not be treated as a luxury add-on, that background checks must be mandatory and centralized, and that residents deserve transparency and accountability. His transformation from grieving husband to reluctant activist mirrored a familiar pattern seen in the aftermath of extreme violence, the survivor forced to give meaning to loss. Meanwhile, the legal process continued its slow march. Appeals were filed, stays were granted. The death sentences were debated in courtrooms and newsrooms alike. Years passed. The public's attention shifted, as it often does, to newer tragedies. But for Rajesh, time did not dull the pain. Each legal delay felt like a reopening of the wound, a reminder that justice, however severe, was never truly final. As the case moved toward its final stages, broader questions emerged. Could execution truly deliver justice? Had the system learned anything? Were reforms being implemented, or merely promised? The answers were as complex and uncomfortable as the crime itself. What was clear, however, was that the murders at Lotus Heights had shattered the myth of gated safety. They revealed a pattern of failure that extended far beyond a single building or city. They showed how unchecked access, ignored histories, and systemic indifference could converge with devastating consequences. And they left behind a survivor who would spend the rest of his life carrying the weight of both memory and meaning. The final reckoning was still to come. As the case moved into the appellate phase, the illusion of finality created by the death sentences began to erode, revealing once again how justice, especially in cases of extreme violence, is rarely clean or conclusive. The appeals filed on behalf of Rakesh Kumar and Sunil Yadav cited procedural errors, questioned the reliability of confessions, and challenged the interpretation of forensic evidence. Their lawyers argued that the trial court had been swayed by public outrage and media pressure, that the rarest of the rare standard had been applied emotionally rather than objectively. These arguments reopened national wounds that many had hoped would begin to heal. High court hearings stretched across months, then years. Each adjournment became another headline. Each delay reignited debate. Protesters gathered outside court buildings holding photographs of Nandini and Ananya, demanding swift justice. Others, including human rights advocates, argued that the death penalty itself was a failure of the system, regardless of the crime. The case became a lightning rod for India's long-standing tension between retribution and reform, between public anger and constitutional restraint. For Rajesh Batra, the appeals process felt like a second sentence imposed on the living. Every court date required him to relive the details of that night, to hear again the names of the men who had destroyed his family, to sit quietly as legal technicalities were debated around the most intimate loss imaginable. He often said later that grief did not fade with time, it simply changed shape. What once felt like raw devastation hardened into a constant, heavy presence, something he carried into every room he entered. During this period, independent investigations into private security practices gained momentum. Government-appointed committees released reports confirming what many already suspected. The security industry in urban India was largely unregulated, fragmented, and dangerously inconsistent. Background checks were often limited to local police verification, which failed to capture interstate criminal histories. Contract workers moved freely between jobs with little oversight. Access controls existed in theory, but were rarely enforced in practice. The Batra's case was repeatedly cited as evidence of what could happen when safety was treated as an administrative formality rather than a core responsibility. Lotus Heights itself became a symbol of institutional denial. While the management initially promised cooperation and reform, internal emails later revealed attempts to deflect blame onto individual guards and third-party vendors. Residents filed lawsuits alleging negligence and misrepresentation. Several families moved out, unable to reconcile the image of safety with the reality of what had occurred. The complex installed new cameras, biometric access systems, and stricter visitor protocols. But for many, the changes came too late. Trust, once broken, proved impossible to restore. In 2016, the High Court upheld the convictions but reserved judgment on sentencing, sending the matter to the Supreme Court for final determination. This decision prolonged uncertainty. The men remained on death row, their lives suspended between execution and commutation. Public interest surged once more. Television debates replayed footage from the trial. Opinion columns dissected the moral implications. The case refused to fade into history. When the Supreme Court finally took up the matter in 2018, it did so against a backdrop of shifting legal philosophy. Globally, momentum was moving away from capital punishment. Domestically, courts had begun scrutinizing death sentences more critically, emphasizing the possibility of reform and the fallibility of the justice system. The Batra's case, with its extreme brutality, forced the court to confront the outer limits of that philosophy. Arguments before the bench were exhaustive. Prosecutors reiterated the cruelty, the betrayal of trust, and the calculated nature of the crime. They argued that sparing the perpetrators would undermine public faith in justice and fail to acknowledge the magnitude of the harm inflicted. Defense counsel countered with psychological evaluations, citing childhood trauma, substance abuse, and socioeconomic deprivation. They argued that life imprisonment without parole would be sufficient punishment, preserving the sanctity of life while ensuring public safety. Rajesh attended every hearing. He listened as his wife and daughter were discussed in abstract legal terms, reduced to victims in a constitutional debate. In private moments, he struggled with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted the finality that execution promised. Another part understood painfully that no sentence could restore what he had lost. Justice, he came to realize, was not a destination but a process, one that often failed to align with emotional truth. In late 2019, the Supreme Court delivered its judgment. The convictions were upheld. The death sentences, however, were commuted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The court cited evolving standards of decency, the need for consistency in sentencing, and the principle that punishment must allow for the possibility of moral reform, even if release was never contemplated. The ruling was legally reasoned, meticulously argued, and immediately polarizing. Public reaction was swift and divided. Many expressed outrage, accusing the court of betraying victims and prioritizing offenders' rights over justice. Others praised the decision as a sign of judicial maturity, arguing that the rule of law must remain insulated from public anger. For Rajesh, the ruling landed with a quiet finality. The men who had destroyed his family would die in prison. They would never walk free, but they would live. That fact, he admitted later, was something he would wrestle with for the rest of his life. What followed was not closure, but transition. Media attention gradually waned. The case receded from headlines, replaced by new tragedies, new debates, but its impact endured in less visible ways. Laws regulating private security agencies were strengthened. Mandatory centralized background checks were introduced in several states. Residential complexes faced stricter compliance requirements. Training standards for guards were raised. None of these measures could undo the past, but they represented a collective acknowledgement of failure. Rajesh Batra chose not to retreat from public life. Instead, he founded a non-profit organization dedicated to victim support and urban safety reform. The foundation provided legal assistance to families navigating the criminal justice system, advocated for policy changes, and funded research into crime prevention in urban environments. Rajesh spoke not as an expert, but as someone who had lived the consequences of systemic neglect. His voice carried a weight that statistics could not. In interviews, he often returned to the same theme, that the crime was not an anomaly but a warning. He spoke of how modern cities create proximity without accountability, how economic divides breed resentment, how systems designed for efficiency often ignore human risk. He reminded audiences that security was not just about gates and cameras, but about responsibility, oversight, and dignity for everyone involved. Years passed. The apartment at Lotus Heights remained empty for a long time before being sold. New residents moved in, unaware or unwilling to confront the history embedded in its walls. Life, as it always does, continued. But the echoes of that night remained, carried in policy documents, court judgments, and the quiet resilience of a man who survived when he should never have had to. The story of the Batras had become more than a crime. It was a case study, a cautionary tale, a mirror held up to a society grappling with the costs of progress. And as the legal chapter closed, a deeper question lingered, unresolved and uncomfortable. Had justice truly been served, or had it merely taken a different form? The answer, like the grief itself, refused to be simple. In the years that followed the Supreme Court's ruling, the case of the Batra murders settled into a strange dual existence, fading from daily conversation while remaining permanently etched into the legal, cultural, and emotional landscape of urban India. For the public, it became a reference point, invoked whenever discussions turned to gated security failures, contract labor risks, or the limits of punishment. For policymakers, it became a justification, a citation in white papers and parliamentary debates about reform. For Rajesh Batra, it was never a case at all. It was the absence that greeted him every morning and followed him into every quiet moment, a silence shaped like a wife and a daughter who should have been there. Life after the trial unfolded slowly and unevenly. Rajesh sold the apartment in Lotus Heights, unable to reconcile its walls with the memories they contained. He relocated to a quieter neighborhood, one without the glossy promise of absolute safety. Friends worried about him, about his isolation, about whether he would ever find equilibrium again. Grief, however, had not diminished his sense of purpose. If anything, it had sharpened it. He immersed himself in his foundation's work, meeting families who had suffered violent loss and guiding them through a system that often felt as cold and impenetrable as the crimes themselves. He understood their confusion, their anger, their exhaustion, because he had lived it. What distinguished Rajesh's advocacy was its refusal to simplify. He resisted narratives that framed the crime as purely monstrous or purely systemic. He spoke openly about the perpetrators' backgrounds without excusing their actions. He acknowledged poverty, neglect, and abuse as factors while insisting they did not absolve responsibility. In doing so, he challenged audiences to hold multiple truths at once, to resist the comfort of easy answers. The crime, he insisted, was the result of individual choices enabled by institutional failures, and addressing only one side of that equation guaranteed repetition. The ripple effects of the case continued to surface in unexpected places. Urban planners began consulting criminologists when designing residential spaces. Insurance companies revised risk models for high-rise complexes. Resident welfare associations demanded greater transparency from security providers. Courts cited the case when emphasizing employer liability in crimes facilitated by access and negligence. None of these changes were dramatic on their own, but together, they represented a slow recalibration of how safety was understood and implemented. The debate over the commutation of the death sentences never truly resolved. For some, the Supreme Court's decision remained a moral failure, an intellectual exercise divorced from the visceral reality of loss. For others, it marked progress, evidence that even the most horrific crimes would not erode constitutional principles. Rajesh himself rarely engaged in these arguments publicly after the ruling. He had come to understand that no verdict could align perfectly with grief. Justice, in his experience, was not about satisfaction, but about responsibility, ensuring that suffering was not rendered meaningless through inaction. Privately, he grappled with questions he could never fully answer. Would execution have brought peace? Would it have honored Nandini and Ananya in a way life imprisonment could not? Or would it simply have added another death to a story already defined by loss? These questions lingered without resolution, coexisting with his commitment to preventing future harm. He learned to live alongside them, accepting uncertainty as part of survival. As time passed, the foundation bearing his family's legacy expanded its focus. It funded safety audits for schools, supported trauma counseling for victims of violent crime, and partnered with local governments to pilot centralized background check systems. Rajesh often said that his wife had believed deeply in education as a force for change, and that his daughter had believed in care as a form of strength. In this work, he felt closest to them, as though their values continued to shape the world through his hands. The story of the Batra family gradually transformed from a headline into a lesson. It illustrated how modern infrastructure could conceal ancient vulnerabilities, how trust could be weaponized, and how progress without accountability created new forms of danger. It exposed the myth that safety could be purchased through gates and guards alone, reminding a rapidly urbanizing society that security was ultimately a human responsibility. Nandini Batra was remembered not just as a victim, but as a teacher, a volunteer, a woman who believed fiercely in kindness, even when the world offered little evidence it deserved it. Ananya Batra was remembered as a girl whose future had been rich with possibility, whose curiosity and compassion had outpaced her years. Their lives, though cut short, left imprints that extended beyond the circumstances of their deaths. The men who killed them remained behind bars, their names fading into the background noise of prison records and legal archives. They would not be released. They would not be redeemed in the public eye. Their existence would end quietly, far removed from the lives they had destroyed. History would remember them only insofar as they served as a warning of what unchecked access and ignored warning signs could enable. In the end, the true legacy of the case was not found in court judgments or sentencing debates, but in the uncomfortable truths it forced into the open. That evil does not always arrive as an outsider. That systems fail most catastrophically when they assume trust without verification. That justice, however carefully constructed, can never fully repair what violence shatters. And that survival carries with it a responsibility few would ever choose, but some are forced to bear. Rajesh Batra continued forward, not because he had found peace, but because standing still was not an option. In honoring his wife and daughter, he transformed personal tragedy into collective responsibility, ensuring that their story would not simply horrify but instruct. In that way, their lives, though stolen, continued to matter. And for a city that once believed glass walls and guarded gates could keep darkness at bay, the lesson endured. Safety is not an illusion to be sold, but a commitment that must be upheld relentlessly before the night arrives. Story 4. On a cold February night in 2023, the suburban town of Brookhaven, Colorado, appeared exactly as it had been designed to appear: quiet, orderly, insulated from danger. Snow rested neatly along manicured sidewalks. Porch lights glowed warmly behind trimmed hedges. Surveillance cameras blinked silently above garage doors, and the town's website proudly advertised Brookhaven as one of the safest communities in the state. Low crime rates, excellent schools, strong community values. It was the kind of place people moved to, believing that bad things happened elsewhere, to other families, in other towns. What no one in Brookhaven wanted to admit was that safety, like trust, can be engineered on paper and still collapse in reality. That night, inside a two-story home on Willow Ridge Drive, a family that embodied everything Brookhaven promised was being destroyed, not by strangers breaking in from the outside, but by danger that had already been allowed inside the system meant to keep them safe. The Keller family had lived in Brookhaven for just under 6 years. Michael Keller, 46, was a senior software architect for a cybersecurity firm based in Denver. He worked long hours but remained deeply involved in his community, coaching youth soccer on weekends and serving on the Homeowners Association Safety Committee. He believed in systems, in protocols, in the idea that if something was designed well enough, it could prevent failure. His wife, Laura Keller, 44, was a pediatric physical therapist who worked at a children's rehabilitation center nearby. Colleagues described her as gentle but unwavering, the kind of professional who treated every child as if they were her own. Their daughter, Emily Keller, was 15 years old in early 2023. She was bright, perceptive, and intensely observant of the world around her. Emily played violin in her school orchestra, volunteered at an animal shelter, and had recently begun talking about studying psychology someday. She was curious about people, how they thought, why they behaved the way they did. Her teachers described her as thoughtful rather than loud, empathetic rather than attention-seeking. To her parents, she was everything they had hoped to protect by choosing a place like Brookhaven. The Kellers believed they had done everything right. They chose a safe neighborhood. They installed a security system. They knew their neighbors. They attended town halls. They trusted the systems designed to protect them. What they did not know was that someone had been watching them for months. Brookhaven, like many suburban developments, relied heavily on contracted labor. Landscaping crews, maintenance technicians, delivery drivers, and private security rotated through the neighborhood daily. The contracts were awarded to the lowest bidders, and oversight was minimal. Background checks were technically required, but enforcement was inconsistent, fragmented across agencies, and largely dependent on self-reporting. Among those workers was 29-year-old Tyler Reed, a maintenance subcontractor assigned to multiple Brookhaven properties. Tyler had a history that followed him quietly across state lines: domestic violence charges in Missouri, a restraining order filed by an ex-girlfriend in Kansas, and an arrest for unlawful restraint that had been reduced to a misdemeanor after a plea deal. None of it appeared on the background check conducted by the subcontracting company. Records were incomplete. Jurisdictions didn't communicate. Red flags were buried under paperwork. Tyler was known around Brookhaven as quiet, helpful, and unremarkable. He fixed garage doors, adjusted smart locks, replaced faulty motion sensors. Residents trusted him because the system told them to. He wore a uniform. He carried a tablet. He had authorized access codes. No one questioned his presence. Over time, Tyler learned the rhythms of the neighborhood. He learned which houses were empty during the day, which families traveled frequently, which security systems were actually monitored, and which were merely decorative. He learned that the Keller's house had a side entrance camera that intermittently failed during cold weather. He learned that Michael often worked late on Tuesdays. He learned that Laura and Emily were sometimes home alone in the evenings. He also learned something else, something that would later haunt every investigator who reviewed the case. He learned that Emily was kind. She smiled when she passed workers in the neighborhood. She said thank you. She asked polite questions. She treated people like people. What her parents saw as empathy, Tyler interpreted as access. The first boundary he crossed was small. A comment about her violin case, a question about school, nothing overt, nothing that raised alarms. Over time, the comments became more personal. Emily mentioned it once to her mother casually without fear. Laura reminded her to keep conversations brief and public. They trusted that was enough. It was. On February 18, 2023, Michael Keller left early for a 3-day work trip to San Francisco. Laura and Emily spent the day running errands and preparing for a snowstorm forecasted for that evening. By nightfall, the neighborhood was quiet. Roads were slick. Visibility was low. Security patrols were reduced due to weather conditions. At 9:42 p.m., Tyler Reed used his authorized access code to enter the Keller home through the side door. The system logged the entry as maintenance override. No alarm was triggered. Inside, Laura was folding laundry in the living room. Emily was upstairs in her bedroom, headphones on, practicing violin. When Laura heard the door open, she assumed Michael had forgotten something and returned early. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She turned toward the hallway. That moment, brief, ordinary, entirely reasonable, was the last moment of normalcy the Keller family would ever experience. Tyler attacked Laura immediately, striking her with a blunt object taken from the garage. She fell, stunned but conscious. He restrained her with zip ties he had brought with him, working quickly, efficiently. Emily heard the noise upstairs and came to the landing just in time to see her mother being dragged across the floor. She screamed. Tyler chased her, catching her halfway down the stairs. He forced her into her parents' bedroom and bound her as well. He told them it was a robbery. He told them to cooperate and no one would be hurt. He repeated the lie calmly, almost rehearsed. For the next 5 hours, Laura and Emily Keller were held captive in their own home. Tyler moved through the house methodically, disconnecting cameras, disabling internal sensors, and wiping logs from the smart home system. He demanded passwords. He searched for valuables. He alternated between threats and false reassurance, maintaining control through fear and confusion. Outside, snow continued to fall. Neighbors slept. Security systems recorded data no one was watching in real time. At 2:17 a.m., Laura attempted to trigger her smartwatch's emergency function by rubbing it against the bed frame. The signal briefly connected, then dropped. The alert never reached emergency services. Later analysis would show the house's Wi-Fi router had been deliberately disabled. By early morning, Tyler realized time was no longer on his side. Michael would return. Someone would notice. The longer he stayed, the greater the risk. What began as an act driven by obsession and resentment had escalated beyond any exit that didn't involve permanent silence. At approximately 4:55 a.m., Tyler strangled Laura Keller. Emily was still alive when it happened. What followed would define the case not only as one of the most brutal crimes Brookhaven had ever seen, but as one of the most preventable. Shortly after 6:30 a.m., a neighbor's security camera captured Tyler Reed exiting the Keller home carrying a backpack. Snow obscured parts of the footage, but his face was visible. He walked calmly to a parked maintenance van and drove away. At 7:12 a.m., Michael Keller's flight landed in Denver. At 8:03 a.m., he arrived home. Nothing in his years of designing security systems had prepared him for what he was about to find. Michael Keller knew something was wrong the moment he pulled into the driveway, though nothing appeared disturbed at first glance. The snow had been shoveled sometime during the night, a detail that confused him because neither Laura nor Emily ever bothered before sunrise. The porch light was still on. The side gate stood slightly ajar. These were small things, the kind the mind tries to rationalize away, but they pressed against him with a quiet urgency as he stepped out of the car and felt the cold bite through his coat. He unlocked the front door and called out Laura's name, then Emily's, his voice echoing back at him through a house that felt unnaturally hollow. The silence was wrong. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of early morning. It was dense, heavy, like a held breath. As he moved farther inside, the smell hit him first, metallic and sharp, clashing with the lavender detergent Laura used on the laundry. He followed it down the hallway, past the living room where a basket of folded clothes sat untouched, past the kitchen where a mug of tea had gone cold hours ago, and into the master bedroom where the world he knew ended abruptly. Laura lay on the floor beside the bed, her body angled unnaturally, eyes half open, skin already cooling. Michael didn't scream at first. His mind rejected what it was seeing, clinging to the absurd hope that she was unconscious, that this was some elaborate misunderstanding that could still be undone. He dropped to his knees, shaking her gently, calling her name again and again, until the truth asserted itself with crushing finality. Then he screamed, a sound that tore out of him raw and animal, echoing through the house and into the empty street beyond. Panic surged as another realization hit him with terrifying force. Emily. He staggered upright, his legs barely holding him, and ran through the house calling her name louder, desperation turning each syllable into a plea. He found her in her bedroom, bound, bruised, alive but barely conscious, her eyes fluttering open as he reached her side. She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Michael untied her with shaking hands, cradling her as he fumbled for his phone and called 911, his words tumbling over each other, incoherent with shock and terror. First responders arrived within minutes, lights slicing through the snowy morning, shattering the illusion of normalcy Brookhaven had cultivated for so long. Paramedics rushed Emily to the hospital while police sealed off the house, their faces grim as they began to piece together the scene. Michael sat on the curb wrapped in a blanket, his clothes stained, his hands still trembling, answering questions he barely understood. He told them about Tyler Reed as soon as the name surfaced in his mind, the maintenance worker who had been around so often he'd become invisible. He remembered seeing his name on work orders, trusting that the system had vetted him. That trust now felt like a betrayal carved into his chest. At the hospital, Emily drifted in and out of consciousness, her body bearing the marks of restraint and assault, her mind fractured by what she had witnessed. Doctors stabilized her and moved her into intensive care, while a hospital social worker stayed by her side, speaking softly, reminding her she was safe now even as the word felt meaningless. Michael sat outside her room for hours, staring at the floor, replaying every decision that had led them here, every moment he had believed they were protected because a checklist said so. Meanwhile, detectives began pulling data from every available source. Security cameras from neighboring houses, license plate readers on nearby roads, access logs from the Keller home smart system. What they found was a mosaic of failure. Tyler Reed's access code had been active long past the completion of his assigned work. His background check, performed by a third-party vendor, had flagged no issues because it relied on a limited database that excluded out-of-state misdemeanors and dismissed restraining orders as civil matters. His maintenance van had been rented through a shell company that subcontracted labor with minimal oversight. Each layer of the system had done just enough to appear functional, while allowing a dangerous individual to move freely within it. By noon, Brookhaven was swarming with law enforcement and media vans. News helicopters hovered overhead as reporters speculated about motives and safety, their voices carrying into living rooms across the town. Parents kept their children home from school. Neighborhood forums exploded with fear and anger, residents demanding answers about how something like this could happen here. The town council released a statement expressing shock and sympathy, promising a full investigation, but the words rang hollow against the reality unfolding in real time. Detectives identified Tyler Reed as a person of interest within hours, but finding him was another matter entirely. His phone had gone dark shortly after leaving the Keller home. Credit card activity ceased. The maintenance van was found abandoned near a bus terminal in Aurora, wiped clean of usable prints. Surveillance footage showed him boarding a bus heading east, his face obscured by a hood, his movements calm and deliberate. He had planned this escape, just as he had planned his entry. As the manhunt expanded across state lines, Emily's condition stabilized, but the psychological damage surfaced with brutal clarity. She woke screaming in the middle of the night, convinced she was still bound, still trapped. She flinched at sudden movements, at unfamiliar voices, at the beep of hospital machines. When detectives gently attempted to interview her, she shut down, her eyes unfocused, her body retreating inward. Trauma specialists advised patience, reminding everyone that survival itself was a victory, even if it came with scars no one could see. Michael stayed with her constantly, sleeping in a chair by her bed, reading to her when she could tolerate it, holding her hand through the worst moments. Grief for Laura pressed down on him relentlessly, but he pushed it aside, focusing on Emily with a single-minded intensity. He couldn't save his wife. He would save his daughter. 3 days later, a break came from an unexpected place. A gas station clerk in rural Nebraska recognized Tyler Reed from a nationwide alert after he paid cash for food and lingered near the restroom longer than necessary. Surveillance footage confirmed the match. State troopers were alerted, and a pursuit ensued when Tyler attempted to flee in a stolen vehicle. The chase ended when he crashed into a guardrail on a county road, emerging from the wreck disoriented but alive. He was taken into custody without further incident. The arrest brought a surge of relief, but it was tempered by the grim reality of what lay ahead. Extradition, charges, trial. For Emily, the knowledge that he was caught did little to ease the terror that had rewired her sense of safety. For Michael, it ignited a new kind of anger, one that extended beyond Tyler Reed himself and into the systems that had allowed him to operate unchecked. During interrogation, Tyler initially denied everything, then pivoted to half-truths and justifications, blaming stress, circumstance, the victims themselves. He spoke with chilling detachment about the night at the Keller home, correcting detectives on timelines, minimizing violence, refusing to acknowledge Laura by name. The recordings of those interviews would later become central to the prosecution's case, and a source of outrage when excerpts leaked to the public. Charges were filed swiftly: first-degree murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, aggravated assault, burglary, and a host of related offenses. Prosecutors announced they would seek the maximum penalty under Colorado law. Outside the courthouse, Candles and flowers accumulated beneath a hastily erected memorial bearing Laura Keller's name. Strangers left notes apologizing for a failure they couldn't quite articulate, for a safety that had turned out to be an illusion. As weeks turned into months, Emily began a slow, painful process of recovery. Therapy sessions replaced hospital rooms. Medications dulled the sharpest edges of panic, but couldn't erase the memories. She struggled with guilt for surviving when her mother hadn't, a burden trauma counselors recognized all too well. Michael watched his daughter fight battles no teenager should ever have to face, and with each passing day, his grief hardened into resolve. He began attending town meetings, demanding transparency about contracting practices and background checks. He spoke to reporters, not as a man seeking attention, but as a father determined that Laura's death would not be reduced to a statistic. He worked with advocacy groups pushing for reform in private security oversight, telling anyone who would listen that safety systems are only as strong as their weakest ignored detail. Behind closed doors, prosecutors prepared for a trial that promised to be as emotionally charged as it was legally complex. The defense signaled they would argue diminished capacity, pointing to Tyler Reed's history of instability, a strategy that infuriated the Keller family and much of the public. The stage was set for a courtroom battle that would force Brookhaven, and eventually the nation, to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, accountability, and the cost of convenience. And as the trial date approached, Emily made a decision that surprised even her therapists. She told her father she wanted to testify, not because she owed anyone an explanation, but because she refused to let the last word belong to the man who had tried to silence her. The trial of Tyler Reed began in late October 2023, 8 months after the night that had forever altered the Keller family and shattered Brookhaven's carefully cultivated sense of safety. From the moment jury selection started, it was clear this case carried a weight that extended far beyond a single courtroom. Prospective jurors were asked not only whether they could remain impartial, but whether they could confront graphic evidence, harrowing testimony, and questions about systemic failure without letting emotion overwhelm judgment. Several were dismissed after admitting they could not promise that. Others sat in silence, faces tight, aware that whatever decision they rendered would echo long after the verdict was read. The prosecution opened by dismantling the illusion that this crime was sudden or random. They laid out a meticulous timeline showing how Tyler Reed had embedded himself into the fabric of Brookhaven over months, exploiting access granted by convenience-driven systems that prioritized efficiency over verification. They showed work orders bearing his name, access logs confirming his ability to override alarms, and security footage placing him at the Keller home repeatedly long before the night of the attack. This, the prosecutor argued, was not a momentary lapse or crime of passion, but a deliberate campaign built on opportunity and neglect. When they described the night of February 18th, the courtroom fell into an almost unbearable stillness. Jurors watched surveillance footage from nearby homes, the timestamp crawling forward as the snow fell steadily, unaware of the horror unfolding behind closed doors. They listened to 911 recordings from Michael Keller's frantic call, his voice breaking as he tried to explain what he had found, the operator's calm instructions clashing painfully with his panic. Several jurors wiped their eyes. One stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as if afraid that blinking might release something he could not contain. The defense, for its part, leaned heavily on the narrative they had signaled months earlier. They portrayed Tyler Reed as a man shaped by instability, neglect, and untreated mental illness, arguing that his actions were the result of impaired judgment rather than calculated intent. They called psychologists who spoke in clinical terms about impulse control disorders and dissociation, framing the night as a tragic convergence of factors rather than a series of choices. They avoided looking directly at the Keller family when they spoke, focusing instead on the abstract language of diagnosis and probability. Tyler himself sat at the defense table throughout, his demeanor alternating between withdrawn and eerily attentive. He took notes. He whispered occasionally to his attorney. He never once looked at Michael Keller. When Emily entered the courtroom for the first time, escorted by a victim advocate, he kept his gaze fixed on the table in front of him, his face unreadable. Emily's testimony was scheduled for the third week of the trial, a decision made carefully by prosecutors and therapists alike. They wanted her as strong as possible, both emotionally and physically, when she took the stand. The morning she testified, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Reporters filled the back rows. Laura Keller's parents sat behind Michael, hands clasped tightly together, their faces etched with grief that had not softened with time. When Emily was called, she walked slowly to the witness stand, her posture tense but determined. She was 16 now, her face older somehow, her eyes carrying a gravity no teenager should have to bear. She took the oath in a steady voice and sat down, gripping the edge of the chair as if anchoring herself to the present. She began by talking about her mother, about Laura's patience, her laugh, the way she always hummed while cooking. She spoke about ordinary moments, driving to school, practicing violin in the evenings, volunteering together on weekends. The prosecutor allowed this, understanding that to comprehend the loss, the jury needed to see Laura not as a victim but as a person. When the questions turned to the night of the attack, Emily's voice faltered, but she did not stop. She described hearing the noise downstairs, the split second of confusion before fear took over. She described seeing her mother on the floor, the man she recognized as a maintenance worker standing over her. She described being chased, restrained, and threatened, her words precise and unembellished. She did not cry as she spoke, but the effort of control was visible in the way her hands shook and her breathing hitched between sentences. She spoke about the hours that followed, about listening to her mother struggle, about trying to stay quiet to avoid drawing attention to herself, about the moment she realized something was terribly wrong. When she described finding her mother unresponsive, her composure cracked, tears spilling over as she covered her face with her hands. The judge called a brief recess, and Emily was escorted from the courtroom, her father's arm around her shoulders, his own face a mask of barely contained anguish. When testimony resumed, Emily returned and finished what she had come to say. She ended by looking directly at the jury and telling them that she survived because she refused to give up, because she believed someone would come, because she believed the world could still be better than what she had seen that night. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the room with undeniable force. Cross-examination was restrained, almost cautious. The defense asked a few questions about her memory, about the darkness, about stress. Emily answered them calmly, her responses unwavering. When it was over, she stepped down without looking at Tyler Reed, walking out of the courtroom to a standing ovation that the judge quickly silenced, though the sentiment lingered heavily in the air. The prosecution rested soon after, confident that the evidence and testimony had painted an unmistakable picture. The defense called a few additional witnesses, reiterating their arguments about mental health and systemic failure, attempting to shift some measure of responsibility away from Tyler Reed himself. But by then, the narrative had solidified in the minds of many watching. Systems may have failed, but an individual had acted. Closing arguments were delivered over 2 tense days. The prosecution reminded jurors that mental illness does not erase accountability, that planning and execution speak louder than excuses. They urged the jury to consider the choices Tyler Reed made at every step, from exploiting access to silencing a witness. The defense asked for mercy, framing a harsh sentence as another tragedy layered atop an already devastating story. Jury deliberations began on a Friday afternoon. They lasted less than 6 hours. When the jurors returned, the courtroom held its breath. The foreperson stood and read the verdicts one by one. Guilty on all counts. A sound escaped Michael Keller then, something between a sob and a sigh, the release of months of tension crashing through him. Laura's parents wept openly, holding each other as if afraid to let go. Emily closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging as if she had finally set down a weight she'd been carrying since February. Tyler Reed showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read. He stared straight ahead, his face impassive, as if the outcome had been inevitable all along. Sentencing was scheduled for December, and in the weeks that followed, victim impact statements were prepared, their words heavy with grief, anger, and the desperate hope that something meaningful could emerge from the wreckage. Outside the courtroom, conversations began to shift. The trial had exposed uncomfortable truths about how easily trust could be exploited, how thin the line between safety and catastrophe really was. As winter settled over Brookhaven once more, the town found itself changed. Security protocols were rewritten. Contracts were terminated. Background checks expanded. But for the Keller family, reform could not restore what had been taken. They could only move forward, carrying Laura's memory with them, determined that her death would not fade quietly into the archives of another closed case. Sentencing day arrived on a gray December morning in 2023, the sky heavy with low clouds that mirrored the mood inside the courthouse. By then, Brookhaven had learned how to move again, but it did so cautiously, as if any sudden motion might reopen wounds that had barely begun to scar over. News vans lined the street once more, though their presence felt more subdued than during the trial, the frenzy replaced by a somber inevitability. This was not about suspense anymore. It was about reckoning. Tyler Reed was brought into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles. The uniform stripped away the anonymity he had once enjoyed, revealing him not as a maintenance worker or a ghost slipping through systems, but as a man held fully accountable by them. He took his seat without expression, his eyes briefly scanning the room before settling forward. He did not look at the Keller family. The judge began by summarizing the case, his voice steady as he recounted the facts established at trial. He spoke of premeditation, of exploitation of trust, of violence inflicted not only on individuals but on a community's sense of safety. He acknowledged the defense's arguments regarding mental health, but made it clear that the court found no justification that mitigated the severity of the crimes. Responsibility, he emphasized, could not be outsourced to circumstance. Then it was time for victim impact statements. Michael Keller stood first. He approached the podium slowly, a folded sheet of paper in his hand that he barely glanced at. His voice was measured, but the pain beneath it was unmistakable. He spoke about Laura as a partner, a mother, a force of compassion whose absence echoed through every corner of their lives. He described the moment he walked into their home that morning, how time fractured into a before and after he could never escape. He spoke about the burden of explaining to his daughter why her mother was gone, about the guilt of surviving, about the endless loop of questions that had no answers. He ended by saying that justice, whatever form it took, could not bring Laura back, but accountability mattered because it told Emily, and everyone watching, that what happened to them was not acceptable, not forgettable, and not without consequence. Laura's parents followed, their words quieter but no less devastating. They spoke of a daughter lost, of a future erased, of holidays and milestones that would forever carry an empty chair. Their grief filled the room, raw and unfiltered, leaving no space for denial or minimization. Finally, Emily stood. She did not read from a paper. She looked directly at the judge, then at the jury box where strangers had listened to her story and believed her, and finally, for the first and only time, at Tyler Reed. Her gaze did not waver. She spoke about fear, about how it had reshaped her world, shrinking it to the boundaries of rooms she could see and locks she could check. She spoke about nightmares, about waking up convinced she was still trapped, about learning to breathe again one moment at a time. But she also spoke about resilience, about refusing to let what happened define the rest of her life. She told the court that she was not there to ask for mercy or revenge, but for recognition of the harm done, and for a sentence that ensured he could never hurt another family the way he had hurt hers. Her voice shook at the end, but she finished standing tall, a quiet defiance in her posture that resonated far beyond the courtroom. When given the opportunity to speak, Tyler Reed declined. His attorney made a brief statement on his behalf, reiterating earlier arguments and asking for leniency. The words landed flat, drained of the urgency they once carried. The judge deliberated briefly, then delivered the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murder of Laura Keller, plus consecutive sentences totaling an additional 120 years for attempted murder, kidnapping, and related charges. The message was unmistakable. Tyler Reed would never walk free again. As the gavel fell, a collective exhale rippled through the courtroom. It was not relief exactly, but a release of tension that had been held too long. Michael closed his eyes, tears slipping down his face. Emily leaned into her father's side, her head resting against his shoulder. Outside, the world continued, indifferent to the significance of the moment. But inside that room, something had shifted. In the weeks that followed, Brookhaven continued to grapple with the aftermath. Lawsuits were filed against the subcontracting companies whose failures had created the conditions for the crime. State legislators introduced bills aimed at strengthening background check requirements for private security and maintenance workers, closing loopholes that had allowed red flags to be ignored. Advocacy groups cited the Keller case as a catalyst for reform, a stark reminder of what can happen when oversight becomes an afterthought. Michael Keller became an unexpected voice in these efforts. He spoke at conferences, testified before committees, and worked with organizations dedicated to improving safety standards. He did not do it because it eased his grief, but because it gave purpose to it, transforming loss into action. He often said that systems must be designed not for convenience, but for the worst-case scenario, because that is where lives are decided. Emily returned to school part-time in the spring, her path forward cautious but determined. She continued therapy, continued to struggle, continued to heal. She took up her violin again, the music tentative at first, then gradually more confident, a way of reclaiming something that had almost been taken from her. She volunteered with survivor support groups, sitting with others who understood trauma in ways textbooks never could, offering presence rather than solutions. The Keller home on Willow Ridge Drive was eventually sold. A new family moved in, aware of its history but hopeful, like so many before them, that awareness itself could offer protection. The house was renovated, its scars repaired, but those who knew the story understood that some marks remain invisible. Laura Keller's name did not fade into obscurity. It appeared in scholarship funds, in legislation footnotes, in the quiet conversations parents had with their children about trust and vigilance. Her life, though cut short, continued to shape the world she left behind. And Emily, now 17, carried her mother with her into whatever future awaited, not as a symbol of tragedy but as a reminder of love, strength, and the cost of complacency. She knew the world could be dangerous, but she also knew it could be changed, one hard-earned lesson at a time. Because true crime is never just about what happened. It's about what we allow to happen. and what we decide to do once the truth is impossible to ignore. Story 5. On a cold March evening in 2023, the town of Cedar Grove, Wisconsin, was settling into its usual rhythm. The winter snow had finally begun to retreat, leaving behind damp sidewalks, muddy lawns, and the promise of spring that Midwestern towns cling to after months of gray. Cedar Grove was the kind of place where people waved at each other at stop signs, where high school football scores still mattered, and where serious crime felt like something that happened elsewhere. But beneath that calm surface, a chain of decisions had already been set in motion that would shatter the illusion of safety and leave an entire community asking how something so horrific could have gone unnoticed for so long. The victims were the Lawson family, a name that had been synonymous with stability and quiet success in Cedar Grove for years. Daniel Lawson, 42, was a civil engineer employed by the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. He was known as methodical, reserved, and deeply committed to his work, often spending late nights reviewing project plans to ensure everything met safety standards. His wife, Melissa Lawson, 39, was a registered nurse at a nearby regional hospital. She worked rotating shifts in the emergency department, a demanding job that exposed her daily to trauma, but friends said she carried a warmth that made patients feel human even in their worst moments. Together, they had built a life that appeared solid and grounded, centered around their two children, 14-year-old Ethan and 8-year-old Lily. Ethan was at that awkward age where childhood was slipping away, but adulthood had not yet fully arrived. He loved video games and basketball, oscillating between sarcasm and sensitivity in a way that only teenagers seem capable of. Lily, on the other hand, was still firmly planted in the world of imagination. She loved drawing animals, especially horses, and insisted on reading the same bedtime stories over and over, even though she had memorized every word. The Lawson home on Maple Ridge Drive reflected that stage of life, with backpacks by the door, unfinished art projects on the kitchen table, and a sense of movement that spoke of a family constantly juggling responsibilities but doing so together. To outsiders, there were no obvious cracks. The Lawsons attended school events, neighborhood gatherings, and church functions. They paid their bills, maintained their home, and kept largely to themselves. But like many families, what was visible to the community told only part of the story. Over the previous year, subtle changes had begun to surface, small enough to be dismissed individually, but significant in hindsight. Melissa had confided to a coworker that she was exhausted beyond what her schedule could explain. Daniel had grown quieter, more withdrawn, losing weight and skipping social events he once tolerated out of courtesy. There were arguments, neighbors later recalled, though nothing that seemed alarming at the time. Doors closed firmly, voices raised, then silenced. In the fall of 2022, Daniel had been involved in a workplace incident that would later become a critical piece of the puzzle. A routine inspection project had gone wrong, resulting in an internal investigation. While Daniel was not formally disciplined, the scrutiny rattled him deeply. Colleagues noticed a shift in his demeanor. He became increasingly anxious, hyper-focused on perceived mistakes, convinced that his career was on the brink of collapse. At home, that anxiety manifested as irritability and emotional distance. Melissa urged him to seek help, suggesting therapy, time off, anything that might ease the pressure. He resisted, viewing it as a personal failure rather than a temporary crisis. By early 2023, the strain was palpable. Melissa had begun sleeping in the guest room on nights when her shifts left her drained beyond conversation. Ethan spent more time at friends' houses. Lily clung more tightly to her routines, sensing instability she could not articulate. Yet none of this triggered intervention. There were no police calls, no emergency room visits tied to domestic incidents, no official record that anything was seriously wrong. The system, designed to react rather than anticipate, remained silent. Unbeknownst to those around him, Daniel Lawson had begun documenting his thoughts in a private digital journal. Investigators would later uncover entries filled with spiraling fears about losing everything he had built. He wrote about being trapped, about feeling invisible, about a belief that his family would be better off without him. At first, the entries read like textbook depression, but as weeks passed, the tone darkened. References to escape shifted into something more ominous, framing the idea of disappearance not as abandonment, but as resolution. On the afternoon of March 18, 2023, Daniel left work early, citing a migraine. Surveillance footage showed him stopping at a hardware store just outside Cedar Grove. He purchased items that raised no immediate red flags: plastic sheeting, heavy-duty trash bags, duct tape. He paid in cash, declined a receipt, and left without speaking to anyone. In isolation, the transaction meant nothing. In context, it would later become chilling. That evening, Melissa worked a late shift. She texted Daniel shortly after 7 p.m., asking if he could help Lily with her homework and reminding him about Ethan's basketball practice the next morning. Daniel replied with a simple "got it," followed by a heart emoji. It was the last message Melissa would ever receive from her husband. At approximately 9:30 p.m., neighbors noticed the Lawson house unusually quiet. Lights were off in most rooms, earlier than normal for a Saturday night. No one thought much of it. Cedar Grove was full of families who valued early nights and quiet routines. Snowmelt pooled at the curb. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Life continued. Inside the house, something had gone terribly wrong. The next morning, Ethan never showed up for basketball practice. When coaches called Melissa, she assumed there had been a miscommunication. But as the morning wore on and Daniel failed to answer his phone, a sense of unease began to creep in. Melissa left the hospital early, driving home with a growing knot in her stomach that no rational explanation could loosen. At 11:47 a.m., Melissa Lawson pulled into her driveway and immediately sensed something was wrong. The front door was locked, but the house felt empty in a way she couldn't explain. She called out for Daniel, for Ethan, for Lily. There was no response. What she found inside would change Cedar Grove forever. By the time first responders arrived, the quiet street on Maple Ridge Drive was flooded with emergency vehicles. Yellow tape cut through the neighborhood like a scar. News spread rapidly, carried by text messages, social media posts, and whispered phone calls. A family that everyone thought they knew had become the center of an unfolding horror. And as investigators began their work, it became clear that this was not a spontaneous act, not a momentary loss of control, but something that had been building, unnoticed, within the walls of an ordinary American home. The questions were only just beginning. The scene inside the Lawson home unfolded slowly under the careful documentation of Cedar Grove police and county investigators, each step taken with the knowledge that whatever they found would reverberate far beyond Maple Ridge Drive. In the living room, nothing appeared disturbed at first glance. Furniture was neatly arranged, blankets folded over the back of the couch, the television off. It was the kind of room staged by habit rather than intention, a space shaped by routine. But the stillness felt unnatural, as though sound itself had been drained from the air. Officers moved deeper into the house, calling out names that echoed unanswered down the hallway. In the kitchen, a half-prepared dinner sat on the counter. Vegetables had been chopped and left where they lay, beginning to dry around the edges. A pot rested cold on the stove. Melissa would later say this detail struck her hardest, the quiet interruption of something so ordinary. It suggested a moment when time had stopped without warning. The children's backpacks were still by the door, shoes neatly lined beneath the bench. Nothing had been taken. Nothing appeared stolen. This was not a crime committed by an outsider passing through. The first body was found in the master bedroom. Daniel Lawson lay on the bed, positioned carefully, as though someone had wanted him to appear at rest. There were no visible signs of struggle in the room. A handwritten note lay on the nightstand beside him, its pages filled with dense, slanted writing. Investigators immediately recognized it as a suicide note, but its contents would complicate that assumption. Daniel wrote about exhaustion, about feeling cornered by expectations, about believing he had failed his family in ways he could no longer repair. But woven into those lines were references to protection, to saving them from a future he believed would be unbearable. The language was disturbingly calm, almost deliberate. Down the hall, the children's rooms told a different story. Ethan was found in his bedroom, still wearing the clothes he had put on after dinner the night before. There were signs of restraint, subtle but unmistakable, marks on his wrists that suggested compliance rather than resistance. Lily was found in her bed, her favorite stuffed horse tucked under one arm. She appeared peaceful at first glance, a detail that would haunt those who saw her long after the investigation concluded. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle anywhere in the house. Whatever had happened, it had happened quietly, under the guise of normalcy. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment pointed to carbon monoxide poisoning as the cause of death for both children, while Daniel's death appeared to be the result of self-inflicted injury. Investigators soon discovered that Daniel had rerouted a portable generator into the home through the garage, sealing doors and vents with the plastic sheeting he had purchased the day before. The setup had been methodical, precise, and chillingly effective. It was not an impulsive act. It was a plan executed with grim intention. Melissa was escorted from the home in a state of shock, her colleagues from the hospital arriving to support her as she struggled to comprehend what she had lost. She repeated the same question over and over, asking how, asking why, asking whether there had been a mistake. Even as evidence mounted, the reality felt impossible. Daniel was not a monster in her mind. He was a man who made pancakes on Sundays, who helped with homework, who kissed their children goodnight. Reconciling that image with what investigators were describing felt like trying to merge two incompatible worlds. As news of the death spread, Cedar Grove entered a state of collective disbelief. Vigils sprang up outside the Lawson home, candles flickering against the cold March air. Parents hugged their children a little tighter. Teachers struggled to answer questions from students who could not understand how a family could simply disappear overnight. Rumors filled the absence of facts, speculation spreading faster than official statements could contain it. Some insisted there had to be an accomplice. Others clung to the idea of an accident, a misunderstanding, anything that preserved the belief that such violence could not come from within. Investigators began reconstructing Daniel Lawson's final weeks with increasing urgency. They interviewed coworkers, neighbors, friends, anyone who had crossed his path recently. A pattern emerged, subtle but consistent. Daniel had expressed fears about losing his job, about being humiliated professionally, about dragging his family down with him. He had withdrawn socially, avoiding gatherings, declining invitations. Several people recalled conversations in which he spoke in absolutes, framing situations as all or nothing, success or total ruin. At the time, these comments had seemed like stress talking. In retrospect, they read like warning signs. Digital forensics added further layers to the narrative. Daniel's online search history revealed repeated queries about painless ways to die, about carbon monoxide poisoning, about whether children would feel fear during sleep. He had visited forums discussing family annihilation cases, reading accounts of men who had killed their families before taking their own lives. He did not post or comment, but his interest was sustained and specific. Investigators noted that these searches coincided with moments of increased stress at work, creating a timeline that suggested escalation rather than spontaneity. The journal entries became central to understanding his mindset. In them, Daniel framed himself as both victim and protector, trapped by circumstances he believed were closing in. He wrote about love in the same breath as despair, conflating the two into a justification for his actions. Mental health experts consulted by investigators noted the presence of distorted thinking patterns, including catastrophizing and perceived altruism, where harm is rationalized as mercy. These insights would later become a focal point in public discussions about mental health intervention and its limits. Melissa struggled with these revelations. She oscillated between anger and grief, between wanting answers and wanting to escape the details entirely. In private moments, she questioned herself relentlessly. Had she missed signs? Had she pushed too hard? Had she failed to recognize the depth of Daniel's despair? Therapists would later tell her that such questions were common among survivors, but that knowledge did little to ease the weight of self-blame. The official ruling classified the deaths of Ethan and Lily as homicide, with Daniel Lawson identified as the perpetrator, followed by his own suicide. The announcement did not bring closure. Instead, it ignited debate. Media outlets grappled with how to frame the story, balancing the need to report facts with the risk of sensationalizing tragedy. Headlines struggled to capture the complexity of a man who was both a loving father and a killer, a contradiction that defied simple categorization. Community leaders organized town hall meetings, inviting mental health professionals to speak about warning signs and resources. Attendance was high, driven by fear as much as compassion. Parents asked whether such tragedies could be predicted, whether there were safeguards that could prevent them. Experts offered cautious answers, emphasizing that while risk factors exist, certainty is rare. The truth, they said, was uncomfortable. Prevention relies on awareness, communication, and systems that are often underfunded or overlooked. As spring edged closer, Cedar Grove found itself changed. The Lawson house stood empty, a symbol of a nightmare no one wanted to revisit but could not forget. For Melissa, the days blurred together, marked by funerals, paperwork, and the exhausting task of surviving. She leaned on friends, family, and colleagues, but grief remained a solitary journey. Every answer uncovered by investigators seemed to generate new questions, each one more painful than the last. And beneath it all lingered the most troubling realization of all, that the signs had been there, scattered and subtle, and that despite good intentions and loving relationships, no one had managed to intervene before it was too late. The investigation was complete, but the reckoning had only just begun. By late spring 2023, the aftermath of the Lawson family tragedy had begun to settle into a grim rhythm. Cedar Grove, a town that had prided itself on safety and cohesion, now carried a weight it could not easily shake. Conversations at the grocery store, church, and school parking lots frequently returned to the same questions. How could this have happened? What could have been done to stop it? And most painfully, could it happen again? Mental health professionals and law enforcement officials were called upon repeatedly, trying to answer questions that had no easy solutions. Yet amid the collective grief, patterns emerged that both disturbed and enlightened the community. Daniel Lawson had not acted in isolation from warning signs. He had left digital traces, behavioral red flags, and interpersonal cues that, while subtle, had collectively painted a picture that no one had pieced together in time. Law enforcement, in collaboration with mental health experts, began to analyze Daniel's communications, social media activity, and personal journals. Emails to coworkers reflected mounting anxiety, self-doubt, and an obsessive concern over minor errors. Text messages to friends revealed increasing withdrawal, misinterpreted social cues, and a persistent sense of impending failure. The tone of these communications shifted over months, moving from mild worry to despair, then finally to premeditation. One particularly chilling message, sent to a coworker he trusted, read simply, "I don't see a way forward. I have to protect them from what's coming." At the time, the recipient had assumed Daniel meant work-related consequences. In hindsight, investigators understood that Daniel's meaning had been far darker, a silent warning no one had recognized. Community members began examining their own lives and relationships, asking whether they had overlooked similar cues in friends, neighbors, or colleagues. Cedar Grove schools conducted internal reviews, scrutinizing student counseling records to see whether early signs of distress among adolescents had gone unnoticed. Local businesses evaluated their employee support programs, considering whether mental health initiatives were sufficient to identify and assist individuals struggling under stress. The tragedy had revealed systemic vulnerabilities: the absence of proactive mental health screenings, gaps in communication among workplaces, families, and health professionals, and the societal expectation that adults quietly manage their own emotional crises. Melissa Lawson, meanwhile, became an unintentional figure in these conversations. Media outlets interviewed her extensively, often sensitively, sometimes not, asking her to explain how she could have missed the warning signs. She consistently emphasized that no parent, no neighbor, no professional could predict with certainty the actions of someone consumed by private despair. Yet she also spoke passionately about the need for earlier intervention, for resources that identify risk without stigmatizing mental illness. Her words carried weight, echoing across town meetings, statewide forums, and news reports. She was careful to distinguish between mental health struggles and violent intent, noting that most people who experience depression or anxiety never harm anyone, but that the rare convergence of planning and desperation had devastating consequences in her family's case. As spring turned to summer, Cedar Grove slowly shifted from grief into action. Schools hosted workshops on recognizing behavioral red flags, law enforcement launched community outreach programs, and the local hospital expanded its crisis intervention services. Melissa Lawson participated in many of these initiatives, meeting with parents, students, and professionals, sharing both personal experience and cautionary lessons. She created a small foundation aimed at supporting families impacted by suicide and family violence, hoping to provide counseling, educational materials, and financial assistance for therapy services. Her goal was to ensure that other families would have the resources she wished she had accessed sooner, though she was careful to stress that hindsight is never preventative on its own. Meanwhile, forensic experts continued analyzing the Lawson home, not for additional suspects. They were confident Daniel had acted alone, but to understand the mechanics of his actions. They meticulously mapped the generator setup, the venting, the timing, and the subtle measures Daniel had taken to ensure that the carbon monoxide would be lethal. These findings were shared with law enforcement agencies across the state, offering guidance for future investigations and prevention measures. The Department of Public Safety issued advisories about portable generator safety, carbon monoxide detection, and mental health awareness, using the Lawson case as a somber educational example. The public response remained intense. National news outlets covered the story extensively, framing it both as a tragedy of individual despair and as a cautionary tale about systemic gaps in recognizing risk. Mental health organizations debated how to balance privacy with intervention, how to train educators and employers to notice behavioral shifts without overreaching, and how to provide support in ways that could genuinely prevent escalation. Psychologists cited the case in discussions of family annihilation, a rare but devastating phenomenon in which an individual, often a parent, kills multiple family members before taking their own life. Scholars and journalists explored the social pressures that had contributed to Daniel Lawson's mindset, including professional expectations, perceived failures, and the isolation that can accompany modern family life. For Cedar Grove residents, the tragedy was no longer abstract. Every child walking to school, every parent returning home late from work, every quiet night in an otherwise peaceful neighborhood carried echoes of March 18th. Neighbors installed additional security measures. Parents monitored not only their children's routines but their own emotional health, and discussions that once would have seemed uncomfortable became essential. Psychologists noted a phenomenon known as collective vigilance, where communities, shaken by a tragedy, become hyper-aware of risk, sometimes productively, sometimes to the point of anxiety. Cedar Grove balanced on that edge, trying to turn fear into protection without letting grief consume its residents entirely. Melissa, in particular, found herself confronting the duality of survival. She had lost her husband and her children, yet she remained, bearing witness to the tragedy while advocating for change. Every decision she made was weighed against the memory of her family, how to spend her time, whom to speak to, which initiatives to support. Her grief was raw, but it was channeled into action. She spoke at statewide mental health conferences, detailing the overlooked warning signs, the subtle changes in Daniel's behavior, and the systemic gaps that had allowed his despair to metastasize unchecked. Her message was clear. Prevention requires awareness, vigilance, and compassion, and without those, tragedy can strike anywhere, at any time. The psychological aftermath extended to first responders as well. Officers who entered the Lawson home described feeling unsettled by the meticulousness of Daniel's planning. Firefighters noted the haunting calm of the children's rooms, the absence of overt struggle, and the unnerving precision of the carbon monoxide setup. Emergency medical personnel who attempted to assist Melissa, still unaware of the full scope of the deaths when she initially arrived, spoke of an emotional weight that lingered for weeks, highlighting the toll that such tragedies take not only on families, but on those tasked with responding to them. As summer progressed, Cedar Grove's collective consciousness remained shadowed by March 18th. The town had begun to rebuild routines, but each step forward was measured. Parents held their children's hands a little tighter at crosswalks. Teachers watched student interactions with renewed attentiveness. Local clinics reported increased requests for mental health screenings, and the hospital where Melissa worked implemented new protocols for staff stress management and patient risk assessment. The tragedy had sparked systemic change, but the human cost could never be quantified. Amid this slow, painful recovery, questions lingered about what could have been done differently. Could a more robust workplace support system have identified Daniel's escalating anxiety? Could mental health professionals have intervened more effectively if alerted to subtle warning signs? Could family members, friends, or neighbors have noticed and acted sooner? Each inquiry revealed the same uncomfortable truth. Prevention requires alignment across multiple domains: personal, professional, societal, and even then, certainty is elusive. Melissa's resolve, however, remained unwavering. She committed to transforming her grief into something tangible, advocating for awareness campaigns, legislative measures for mental health funding, and community support networks. She became a symbol of resilience in Cedar Grove, a living reminder that even in the aftermath of unimaginable loss, action could still follow. Her work, while rooted in tragedy, began to shape a narrative of hope and precaution for the town, ensuring that the Lawson family's story would not fade into silence. By the fall of 2023, Cedar Grove had begun to adapt to life after the Lawson tragedy, though the shadow of March 18th lingered in every hallway, playground, and street corner. The physical reminders, the empty Lawson home, the snowmelt stains on the driveway, the community memorial in the town square were obvious, but the emotional and psychological scars ran deeper. For Melissa Lawson, the months had been a delicate balance of mourning, advocacy, and quiet endurance. She had become a fixture in town meetings, a voice in the media, and a participant in statewide mental health panels. She often spoke about warning signs, systemic gaps, and the need for proactive intervention, yet always returned to the central message that tragedy could not always be prevented, and survival demanded both reflection and action. Law enforcement had also undertaken internal reviews, analyzing not only Daniel Lawson's digital footprint and communications, but also the subtle cues that had been missed. Policies regarding employee reporting of behavioral concerns were rewritten. Mental health crisis intervention teams were expanded to include more frequent home visits and confidential assessments. Cedar Grove Police Department instituted a community liaison program to help residents navigate the difficult space between awareness and intrusion. Across the state, other departments cited Cedar Grove's tragedy as a model for preventative policy, emphasizing the importance of connecting mental health expertise with law enforcement training. Legislative initiatives began taking shape. Wisconsin state lawmakers introduced bills mandating mental health screening programs for high-stress professions, including engineering, healthcare, and education. Grants were made available for school-based counseling services, aiming to identify warning signs among both students and parents. State mental health agencies began offering specialized training on recognizing premeditated risk behaviors in adults, including subtle planning and research behaviors that could indicate danger to oneself or others. Public awareness campaigns encouraged neighbors to act on concerns and not assume that private despair was harmless. These measures were hailed as proactive steps, though no legislative effort could fully compensate for the personal losses suffered by Melissa and the Cedar Grove community. Melissa's personal journey continued alongside these systemic changes. She engaged with survivor networks, meeting families who had experienced similar forms of family loss, listening to their stories, and sharing her own. She established a foundation in her children's names, focusing on funding for childhood mental health programs, parenting support resources, and education on recognizing distress in family members. Emily and Lily's memories were honored through scholarships, art programs, and community service projects designed to instill awareness and compassion in young people. These efforts gave Melissa a measure of purpose, though they never replaced the physical presence of her children or her husband. The Lawson house remained vacant for several months, a site of both grief and curiosity. When it was eventually sold to a family from out of state, the transaction was met with mixed emotions. Some neighbors were relieved to see life return to the property. Others felt that any new family would be constantly reminded of the house's tragic history. Renovations were extensive. The walls repainted, fixtures replaced, the garage restructured to prevent any repeat of the carbon monoxide setup. Yet residents knew that the invisible imprint of what had occurred there, the fear, the grief, the community trauma, could never truly be erased. Mental health experts continue to dissect the Lawson case in journals, conferences, and workshops, highlighting both warning signs and systemic failures. Daniel Lawson was consistently used as a case study in family annihilation scenarios, a stark example of how private despair can intersect with careful planning to create a catastrophe. Researchers emphasize the importance of early intervention, workplace support programs, family communication, and community vigilance. Yet they also acknowledge the limitations inherent in prevention. Even in a connected, observant community, tragedy can unfold silently and decisively. For Cedar Grove as a whole, the tragedy sparked a subtle cultural shift. Parents were more proactive in discussing emotional well-being with their children. Teachers paid closer attention to changes in student behavior. Friends and neighbors were encouraged to engage in difficult conversations about mental health. The town had once operated under a model of presumed safety, believing that disasters happened elsewhere. After March 18th, that presumption was gone. Fear mingled with awareness, grief mingled with vigilance, and a new rhythm of caution became part of daily life. Melissa, despite enduring unbearable loss, emerged as a figure of quiet resilience. She rarely spoke of forgiveness, focusing instead on understanding, prevention, and legacy. She continued her advocacy work, testified before legislative committees, and consulted with mental health and law enforcement agencies to improve crisis response protocols. She often said that the Lawson family's story should not be remembered solely for tragedy, but as a catalyst for change, a painful lesson that, if learned, could save others. Cedar Grove slowly reclaimed its sense of normalcy, but the Lawson tragedy remained a touchstone for the community. Local schools included mental health awareness in their curriculum. Neighborhood associations established support groups for families at risk. Police and mental health professionals collaborated more closely than ever, combining observational insight with trained intervention to try to detect escalation before it resulted in harm. Residents had learned that the ordinary routines of life could conceal profound distress, and that vigilance, compassion, and communication were essential tools in preventing future tragedies. In the years that followed, Melissa's foundation grew, supporting hundreds of families across Wisconsin and neighboring states. Her efforts brought attention to the invisible pressures many adults face, highlighting the intersection of stress, isolation, and the potential for violence. She spoke tirelessly about her children, ensuring that Ethan and Lily were remembered not as victims, but as individuals full of potential, creativity, and love, whose lives, though cut tragically short, continued to inspire action and awareness. The Lawson case became a defining moment in Cedar Grove's history. It exposed the fragility of assumed safety, the complexities of mental health intervention, and the devastating consequences when despair intersects with planning. It demonstrated the importance of attentive communities, proactive policies, and the willingness to engage with difficult conversations long before they escalate into tragedy. Above all, it reminded the nation that even in ordinary towns, ordinary families, the extraordinary consequences of silence and missed warning signs can reshape lives forever. Melissa Lawson, standing before gatherings, testifying in committees, and quietly continuing her work, remained a symbol of that resilience. She had endured a loss that few could imagine, yet she channeled it into advocacy, education, and systemic change. Cedar Grove, once a town defined by routine and calm, now carried a deeper awareness, a vigilance born from grief, and a commitment to ensure that such tragedy would never unfold unnoticed again. And though the memory of March 18, 2023 would never fade, the lessons it imparted became a living legacy, reminding all who heard the story that the most ordinary lives can hide the most profound struggles, and that awareness, compassion, and action are the only tools to safeguard the innocent. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Midnight. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious,